We are doing Keynes' 1936 work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Looking good. So, in 1936, one of his seminal works, Keynes critiques classical economics, particularly the theories of employment and income distribution, emphasis on the shortcomings of classical economic theory in addressing unemployment and economic crises. He's got a ton of books, book 3, book 4, book 5, book 6. 24 chapters that we're going to be getting through, just the highlights and the overview. There's a couple of key concepts that we've got to cover. Effective demand, which is the total demand for goods and services in the economy at various levels of employment. The marginal propensity to consume, the proportion of additional income that is spent on consumption. The multiplier effect, the process by which an initial change in spending leads to greater change in overall economic activity. The marginal efficiency of capital, which is the expected profitability of an additional unit of capital. Liquidity preference, which is the desire to hold cash rather than investments that may take time to liquidate, which is important. Fiscal and monetary policy. Government interventions through the spending and taxation, which is the fiscal policy, and managing the money supply and interest rates, the monetary policy, to influence economic activity. So the many implications of this book essentially are that Keynes is arguing the economies could be in equilibrium with high unemployment, advocate for the active government intervention to manage demand, especially during recessions, emphasize the role of government spending and monetary policy in stabilizing the economy and promoting full employment. Okay, some footnotes that we need to talk about. Classical economics, which is the body of works like economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, that advocated for free market and minimal government intervention. A liquidity trap is a situation where low interest rates do not stimulate additional investment or consumption, rendering monetary policy ineffective. That is what we're going to be diving into. So without further ado, let's go to the first highlight, and this is actually the economic consequences of the piece as well as the general theory. It opens up talking about his early life and his background and how he's gotten to where he's gotten. It does say that the economic consequences of the piece. There was an economic utopia. An inhabitant of London in 1900 might have felt that the world was his oyster. After all, he could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantity that he might see fit and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. This is like, 1900, and you can order stuff to your doorstep, which has been something that we've been doing for quite some time now and only increased the efficiency of. Most important of all, wrote Keynes, that same Londoner regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement, and any deviation from its aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable. Psychological instability of the laboring and capitalist classes I highlighted, and the instability of Europe's claim, coupled with the completeness of her dependence on the food supplies of the New World, all of these were seeds of war. And he's still talking about the economic consequences of the peace, and then after World War I, and goes on to talk a little bit about the general theory here in the introduction. And this is where we start getting some of our major highlights regarding the book. Keynes' attention increasingly focused on what he saw as the central problem, which is mass unemployment. The self-regulating market was clearly not regulating itself. At the book's outset, Keynes offered a summary of his argument. The outline of our theory can be expressed as follows. When employment increases, aggregate real income is increased. The psychology of the community is such that when aggregate real income is increased, aggregate consumption is increased, but not by so much as income. Hence, employers would make a loss if the whole of the increased employment were to be devoted to satisfying the increased demand for immediate consumption. Thus, to justify any given amount of employment, there must be an amount of current investment sufficient to absorb the excess of total output over what the community chooses to consume when employment is at the given level. For unless there is an amount of investment, the receipts of the entrepreneurs will be less than is required to induce them to offer the given amount of employment. And to sustain prices, he concluded Book 1 with these lines: "It may well be that the classical theory represents the way in which we should like our economy to behave, but to assume that it actually does so is to assume our difficulties away." And I think that the more you read this, the more compelling it gets, the more quote-unquote mic drops he does towards the end in making his case. And I think that's why this is such a good book, right? This is seminal. So that's why this book is great. The social object of skilled investment should be to defeat the dark forces of time and ignorance which envelop our future. The actual private object of the most skilled investment today is to beat the gun, as the Americans so well express it, to outwit the crowd, and to pass the batter, depreciating half crown to the other fellow. And he goes on to kind of argue against that. But the role that the quantity of money played in the economic system was a topic that interested Keynes immensely. Circumstances can develop which even a large increase in the quantity of money may exert a comparatively small influence on the rate of interest. For a large increase in the quantity of money may cause so much uncertainty about the future that liquidity preferences due to the precautionary motive may be strengthened, whilst opinion about the future of the rate of interest may be so unanimous that a small change in present rates may cause a mass movement into cash. It is interesting that the stability of the system and its sensitiveness to changes in the quantity of money should be so dependent on the existence of a variety of opinion about what is uncertain. The propensity might even lead to diminished employment. And he talks about an active individual saving. It lays out the summary of Book 5, Book 6, the 1930s, and World War II. And then the introduction wraps up with Keynes' legacy. It gives us some further reading, everything from Marx to Dudley Dillard to Henry Hazlitt and Charles Hession, Paul D. Hill, and a ton more. Adam Smith, of course, gets quoted. I can't wait till we get there. So without further ado, now we're going to dive into the general theory of employment, interest, and money. I didn't highlight much in the preface, but let's get to Book 1, Introduction. And I think he summarizes it, opens up his case, right, with this beautiful paragraph, which I'll read the first paragraph of the book, but we're going to skip through the highlights from here on out. Chapter 1, The General Theory. I have called this book The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, placing the emphasis on the prefix general. The object of such a title is to contrast the character of my arguments and conclusions with those of the classical theory of the subject upon which I was brought up and which dominates the economic thought, both practical and theoretical, of the governing and academic classes of this generation, as it has for 100 years past. I shall argue that the postulates of the classical theory are applicable to a special case only and not to the general case, the situation which it assumes being a limiting point of the possible positions of equilibrium. Moreover, the characteristics of the special case assumed by the classical theory happen not to be those of the economic society in which we actually live, with the result that its teaching is misleading and disastrous if we attempt to apply it to the facts of experience. So this is why this book gets really good, is because this picks apart many of the systems that we have in place. And a lot of these systems are based on academia in many ways, and they're kind of entrenched. And so he's going to go through this book and kind of show, well, here's the classical theory, but from real life experience and study, this is what's actually happening. And I think it's just a very eye-opening book. Highly recommend actually reading it. It's very heavy in the math, so we skipped a lot of that because we're just not going to do a whiteboard presentation, but worth it. So let's do the footnote real quick. The classical economists was a name invented by Marx to cover Ricardo and James Mill and their predecessors. That is to say, for the founders of the theory which culminated in the Ricardian economics. I have become accustomed, perhaps perpetrating a solecism, to include in the classical school the followers of Ricardo, those, that is to say, who adopted and perfected the theory of the Ricardian economics, including, for example, J.S. Mill, Marshall, Edgeworth, and Professor Pigou. Chapter 2 is the postulates of classical economics. My first highlight isn't until part 2 of this chapter. Whilst workers will usually resist a reduction of money wages, it is not their practice to withdraw their labor whenever there is a rise in the price of wage goods. On the next page, when money wages are rising, that is to say, it will be found that real wages are falling. And when money wages are falling, real wages are rising. This is so important because we have to understand the difference between what a real wage is and what a money wage is, right? Money wage is like what you are paid on your paycheck. But like the real wage, well, what is the real wage? So that's important to pay attention to. The traditional theory maintains, in short, that the wage bargains between the entrepreneurs and the workers determine the real wage. So that's the classical. The first relates to the actual behavior of the labor, a fall in real wages. Okay, pardon me. Let me go back. To sum up, there are two objections to the second postulate of the classical theory. The first relates to the actual behavior of labor. A fall in real wages due to a rise in prices with money wages unaltered does not, as a rule, cause the supply of available labor on offer at the current wage to fall below the amount actually employed prior to the rise of prices. Okay, the rise of prices, what's happening right now? Got a lot of price rises, a lot of like wage increases, but they're just like raising the minimum wage. This is money wages. But the other more fundamental objection further down I've highlighted, which we shall develop in the ensuing chapters, flows from our disputing the assumption that the general level of real wages is directly determined by the character of the wage bargain. And this will be our contention. Essentially, there may exist no expedient by which labor as a whole can reduce its real wage to a given figure by making revised money bargains with the entrepreneurs. So, the attempt to elucidate this problem will be one of our main themes. We shall argue that there has been a fundamental misunderstanding of how, in this respect, the economy in which we live actually works. So I think that he opens up this book with that just like amazing, like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to say and show how the academia is wrong, how the classical theory is wrong, and we're going to talk about what is actually happening in experience. So that takes us to the last part of chapter 2. At different points in this chapter, we have made the classical theory to depend in succession on the assumptions: 1, that the real wage is equal to the marginal disutility of the existing employment; 2, that there is no such thing as involuntary unemployment in the strict sense; that supply creates its own demand in the sense that the aggregate demand is equal to the aggregate supply price for all levels of output and employment. These 3 assumptions, however, all amount to the same thing in the sense that they all stand and fall together, any one of them logically involving the other 2. Which takes us to chapter 3, the principle of effective demand. I first highlighted factor cost and user cost, in which he says a precise definition of user cost will be given in chapter 6. I think these are important. We're going into lots of heavy footnotes, lots of math, like lots of functions, defining some functions, which I think is important. And just kind of like talking about aggregate supply when employment increases and the things like that, aggregate demand, just laying out Ricardian economics, all of this kind of like history stuff. Now he's getting into book 2, definitions and ideas, and like all of it is important because he does have to lay all of this out to define his argument. And of course, we're gonna skip through to kind of the highlights, of course, the footnotes, the general things that interest us from this general theory. But if you ever were to take a deep dive, this is the book to do it with. Chapter 4, the choice of units. My first highlight looks like it isn't until page 41, and I know I wrote that because this gets referenced later. It's a footnote to, he says that the rate at which the return from the equipment diminishes as employment increases is more rapid than if it would be there were such a surplus. And the footnote to this says, this is the main reason why the supply price of output rises with increasing demand, even when there is a surplus of equipment identical in type with the equipment in use. We suppose that the surplus supply of labor forms a pool equally available to all entrepreneurs, and that labor employed for a given purpose is rewarded, in part at least, per unit of effort, and not with strict regard to its efficiency and its actual particular employment, which is in most cases the realistic assumption to make. The diminishing efficiency of the labor employed is an outstanding example of rising supply price with increasing output, not due to internal diseconomies. More math. In fact, it looks like our next highlight isn't even until chapter 6 because he just lays out all of the math. In chapter 6 is the definition of income, saving, and investment. Income. My first highlight is that he will also have spent a certain sum designated by A1 on purchasing finished output from other entrepreneurs, and he will end up with a capital equipment, which term includes both his stocks of unfinished goods or working capital and his stocks of finished goods having a value of G. So A plus G minus A1 will be attributable not to, okay, so, and he just, it's more math. He's laying it out, and we're focused mainly on the overall theories and the overarching theme. Next, I highlighted there remains the change in the value of equipment due to unforeseen changes in market values, exceptional obsolescence, or destruction by catastrophe. These may be called windfall loss. The casual significance of net income lies in the psychological influence of the magnitude of V on the amount of current consumption, since net income is what we suppose the ordinary man to reckon his available income to be when he is deciding how much to spend on current consumption. So there is a psychological factor, is what he's saying. The next page, I've highlighted Professor Hayek For example, page 55 has suggested that an individual owner of capital goods might aim at keeping the income he derives from his possession constant so that he would not feel himself free to spend his income on consumption until he had set aside sufficient to offset any tendency of his investment income to decline for whatever reason. Which I thought was a nice little insight, especially considering when people are deciding about like what to spend and what to invest. And it was just another good little reminder to go read some Hayek. Saving and investment. So far as I know, everyone has agreed that saving means the excess of income over expenditure on consumption. The next page, consumer purchasers and investor purchasers will serve us equally well. The criterion must obviously correspond to where we draw the line between the consumer and the entrepreneur. Thus, when we have defined A1 as the value of what one entrepreneur has purchased from another, it follows that saving is equal to A1 minus U. Similarly, we have net saving for the excess of net income over consumption equal to A1 minus U minus V. Our definition of income also leads at once to the definition of current investment. In short, income equals value of output equals consumption plus investment. Saving equals income minus consumption. Therefore, saving equals investment. And what he goes on to wrap up this chapter with is pretty important. But let's go ahead and dive into some highlights from the appendix to chapter 6. An entrepreneur's user cost is by definition equal to A1 plus parentheses G prime minus B prime in parentheses minus G, where A1 is the amount of our entrepreneur's purchases from other entrepreneurs, G the actual value of his capital equipment at the end of the period, and G prime the value it might have had at the end of the period if he had refrained from using it and had spent the optimum sum B prime on its maintenance and improvement. And then I highlighted some more variables that he defines. The concept of user cost enables us, moreover, to give a clearer definition than that usually adopted of the short period supply price of a unit of a firm's saleable output, which is another important definition. In a footnote, I've highlighted, in fact, this assumption is often unrealistic, and there may be one or more points of discontinuity, especially when we reach an output corresponding to the technical full capacity of the equipment. The level of output at which marginal prime cost is exactly equal to the sum of the average of prime and supplementary cost has a special importance because it is the point at which the entrepreneur's trading account breaks even. I thought that was an important note to make, of course. It may be worth pointing out that an entrepreneur does not use his oldest and worst equipment first, merely because its user cost is low, since its low user cost may be outweighed by its relative inefficiency, i.e. by its high factor costs. Right, so you're going to use the most efficient equipment. We have defined the user cost as the reduction in the value of the equipment due to using it as compared with not using it, right? The user cost of the equipment, using it versus not using it. Kind of simple, really. On page 67, I highlighted the assumption that there is a sharp division between raw materials where we must allow for the disinvestment due to using them and fixed capital where we can safely neglect it does not correspond to the facts. Chapter 7, the meaning of saving and investment further considered. My first highlight is on page 69. Investment, thus defined, includes the increment of capital equipment, whether it consists of fixed capital, working capital, or liquid capital, and the significant differences of definition are due to the exclusion from investment of one or more of these categories. I highlighted liquid capital. Anyway. Yeah. We come next to the divergences between saving and investment, which are due to a special definition of income and hence of excess of income over consumption. The definition of income, which I there employed, differed from my present definition by reckoning as the income of entrepreneurs, not their actually realized profits, but in some sense their normal profit. I meant that the scale of output was such that entrepreneurs were earning a less than normal profit from their ownership of the capital equipment, so that they would be under a motive to contract output. Which, I mean, from my personal experience, does make a lot of sense. And from my personal experience, if you're going to contract out, they're going to want you to buy the materials and equipment. I mean, this is just kind of how it goes in the world out there. So I thought a lot of this insight into what it actually meant to see it on paper for some of the stuff that naturally happens is very interesting. Page 71, one of my tabs, and I have an asterisk, a little star. I there argued that change in the excess of investment over saving was the motive force governing changes in the volume of output. Thus, the new argument, though much more accurate and instructive, is essentially a development of the old. The expectation of an increased excess of investment over saving, given the former volume of employment and output, will induce entrepreneurs to increase the volume of employment and output. The significance of both my present and my former arguments lies in their attempt to show that the volume of employment is determined by the estimates of effective demand made by entrepreneurs, an expected increase of investment relative to saving as defined in my treatise on money being a criterion of an increase in effective demand. And then I highlighted that he said Mr. D.H. Robertson has defined today's income as being equal to yesterday's consumption plus investment. And I thought that was a very interesting way to define income, because if you have saving as being defined as investment, and then your consumption plus your investment is like yesterday's investment plus the excess of yesterday's consumption over today's consumption. Thus, when Mr. Robertson says that there is an excess of saving over investment, he means literally the same thing as I mean when I say that income is falling. And the excess of saving, in his sense, is exactly equal to the decline of income in my sense. So he just kind of lays out a little bit of differences there. Chapter 7, Part 4. The much vaguer ideas associated with the phrase forced saving. It is evident that a change in the volume of output and employment will indeed cause a change in income measured in wage units. That a change in the wage unit will cause both a redistribution of income between borrowers and lenders and a change in aggregate income measured in money, and that in either event there will or may be a change in the amount saved. Okay, think about that. Play that back, and it's an important thing to like define saving and investment in such a way, and we'll find that out like kind of like when we get towards the end and he starts dropping like some fire. It's good. Okay. Bentham expressly stated that he had in mind the consequences of an increase in the quantity of money relatively to the quantity of things vendible for money, in circumstances of all hands being employed and employed in the most advantageous manner. In such circumstances, Bentham points out, real income cannot be increased, and consequently additional investment taking place as a result of transition involves forced frugality at the expense of national comfort and national justice. Anywho, real income cannot be increased as an argument. So what does that mean, right? So what does that mean for us once we understand what that means for the economy versus the classical theory versus what Keynes is saying and pointing out? Page 784, the notion that the creation of credit by the banking system allows investment to take place to which no genuine saving corresponds can only be the result of isolating one of the consequences of the increased bank credit to the exclusion of others. If the grant of the bank credit to an entrepreneur, additional to the credits already existing, allows him to make an addition to current investment, which would not have occurred otherwise, incomes will necessarily be increased and at a rate which will normally exceed the rate of increased investment. Moreover, except in conditions of full employment, there will be an increase of real income as well as of money income. Okay, moreover, except in conditions of full employment, there will be an increase of real income as well as money income. Page 75, I highlighted that it is also true that the grant of the bank credit will set up three tendencies. These three tendencies are important. One, for output to increase. Two, for the marginal product to rise in value in terms of the wage unit, which in conditions of decreasing return must necessarily accompany an increase of output. And three, for the wage unit to rise in terms of money. Very important, since this is a frequent concomitant of better employment. And these tendencies may affect the distribution of real income between groups. Every such attempt to save more by reducing consumption will so affect incomes that the attempt necessarily defeats itself. The above is closely analogous with the proposition of which harmonizes the liberty of which every individual possesses to change whenever he chooses the amount of money he holds. I highlighted a little further down, primarily securities, purchase of which is the natural alternative. Okay, holding investable securities is a very great and natural alternative to holding money. This indeed is the fundamental proposition of money. The last sentence before we get to book 3. This is the vital difference between the theory of economic behavior of the aggregate and the theory of the behavior of the individual unit, in which we assume that changes in the individual's own demand do not affect his income. He just had to point out that there's a lot of assumption going on in the economy. Book 3, The Propensity to Assume, Chapter 8. My first highlight is in the first paragraph. So far, we have established the preliminary conclusion that the volume of employment is determined by the point of intersection of the aggregate supply functions with the aggregate demand functions. Okay, we have a really nice math equation here. CW equals X YW, or C equals W times X of YW. I tabbed the amount that the community spends on consumption depends partly on the amount of its income, partly on the other objective attendant circumstances, And 3, partly on the subjective needs and the psychological propensities and habits of the individuals composing it and the principles on which the income is divided between them. 2, the principal objective factors which influence the propensity to consume appear to be the following. 1, a change in the wage unit. Consumption is obviously more a function of real income than of money income. 2, a change in the difference between income and net income. That the amount of consumption depends on net income rather than on income. Think back to capitalism and freedom. Think back to the family unit being the strongest unit of consumption. A change in the difference between income and net income. The amount of consumption depends on net income. So that's like when you are married family unit, your net income goes up, therefore your consumption will go up. 3, windfall changes in capital values not allowed for in calculating net income. The consumption of the wealth-owning class may be extremely susceptible to unforeseen changes in the money value of its wealth. This should be classified amongst the major factors capable of causing short-period changes in the propensity to consume. 4, changes in the rate of time discounting, i.e., the ratio of exchange between present goods and future goods. Another very important concept. This is not quite the same thing as the rate of interest, since it allows for future changes in the purchasing power of money insofar as these are foreseen. Account has also been taken of all kinds of risks, and he goes on defining set par, right, and some negative changes in fiscal policy is 5. 6 is changes in expectations of the relation between the present and the future level of income. The psychological factors that Keynes argues about our economy, I think, are some of the most intriguing and important points that he makes. And so this, wrapping it up with his number 6, the expectations of the relation between the present and the future level of income. People expect certain things about the level of income. And this is a factor that we need to consider. This is like a variable, and he's defining it. It is likely to average out for the community as a whole. Moreover, it is a matter about which there is a rule, too much uncertainty for it to exert much. So people do have a lot of expectations, and we see this all over the place, especially now, because a lot of people say the sky is falling, the world is ending, the economy is over, because, right, they're kind of basing it on this classical theory and not so much what the economy actually is. So on page 86, this simple principle leads, it will be seen, to the same conclusion as before, namely that the employment can only increase pari passu with an increase in investment. And pari passu means equal footing. So the same conclusion, namely that employment can only increase on equal footing with an increase in investment. The increased employment will prove unprofitable unless there is an increase of investment to fill the gap. Mr. Colin Clark's national income, he also shows what a large proportion depreciation, etc., normally bears to the value of investment. I thought it was cool, so I just maybe want to go see if I can find that and read it. This is a block highlight for me. We cannot, as a community, provide for future consumption by financial expedients, but only by current physical output. Insofar as our social and business organization separates financial provision for the future from physical provision for the future, so that efforts to secure the former do not necessarily carry the latter with them, financial prudence will be liable to diminish aggregate demand and thus impair well-being, as there are many examples to testify. The greater, moreover, the consumption for which we have provided in advance, the more difficult it is to find something further to provide for in advance, and the greater our dependence on present consumption as a source of demand. Yet the larger our incomes, the greater, unfortunately, is the margin between our incomes and our consumption. Right? Yet the larger our incomes, the greater, unfortunately, is the margin between our incomes and consumption. There is no answer to the riddle. Chapter 9, the propensity to consume. 2, the subjective factors. Subjective and social incentives which determine how much is spent. There are, in general, 8 motives or objects of subjective character which leads individuals to refrain from spending out of their incomes. All of these I didn't highlight. I highlighted what he summed up, that these 8 motives might be called the motives of precaution, foresight, calculation, improvement, independence, enterprise, pride, and avarice. And we could also draw up, corresponding list of motives to consumption, such as enjoyment, short-sightedness, generosity, miscalculation, ostentation, and extravagance. So let's just go over these 8 motives real quick. I'm going to read through them fast. To build up a reserve against unforeseen contingencies. 2. To provide for an anticipated future relation between income and the needs of the individual or his family, different to which that exists in the present. 3. To enjoy interest and appreciation, i.e. because a larger real consumption at a later date is preferred to a smaller immediate consumption. 4. To enjoy a gradually increasing expenditure since it gratifies a common instinct to look forward to a gradually improving standard of life rather than the contrary, even though the capacity for enjoyment may be diminishing. 5. To enjoy a sense of independence and the power to do things, though without a clear idea or definite intention of specific action. 6. To secure a masse de maneuver to carry out speculative or business projects. To bequeath a fortune. 7. 8. To satisfy pure miserliness, i.e. an unreasonable but insistent inhibition against acts of scripture as such. So, to satisfy pure miserliness, if, that's the thing. Mainly the 4 following. And then he goes to say, apart from the savings accumulated by individuals, there is also a large amount of income, varying from 1/3 to 2/3 of the total accumulation in a modern industrial community such as Great Britain or the US, which is withheld by central and local government, by institutions, and by business corporations for motives largely analogous to, but not identical with those actuating individuals, and mainly the 4 following. The motive of enterprise, to secure resources to carry further capital investment without incurring debt or raising further capital on the market. 2. The motive of liquidity, to secure liquid resources to meet emergencies, difficulties, and depressions. 3. The motive of improvement, to secure a gradually increasing income, which incidentally will protect the management from criticism, since increasing income due to accumulation is seldom distinguished from increasing income due to efficiency. And 4. The motive of financial prudence and the anxiety to be on the right side by making financial provision in excess of usury and supplementary cost, so as to discharge debt and write off the cost of assets ahead of rather than behind the actual rate of wastage and obsolescence. The strength of this motive mainly depending on the quantity and character of the capital equipment and the rate of technical change. AI is technical. Part 2. For aggregate saving is governed by aggregate investment. A rise in the rate of interest, unless it is offset by a corresponding change in the demand schedule for investment, will diminish investment. Hence, a rise in the rate of interest must have the effect of reducing incomes to a level at which saving is decreased in the same measure as investment. Since incomes will decrease by a greater absolute amount than investment, it is indeed true that when the rate of interest rises, the rate of consumption will decrease. But this does not mean that there will be a wider margin for saving. On the contrary, saving and spending will both decrease as interest. But if a higher rate of interest retards investment, our incomes will not and cannot be unchanged. They must necessarily fall until the declining capacity to save has sufficiently offset the stimulus to save given by the higher rate of interest. The more virtuous we are, the more determinedly thrifty, the more obstinately orthodox in our national and personal finance, the more our incomes will have to fall when interest rises, relatively to the marginal efficiency of capital. Which brings us to Chapter 10, the marginal propensity to consume and the multiplier. All right, Chapter 10 is the marginal propensity to consume and the multiplier. We established in Chapter 8 that unemployment can only increase pari passu with investment unless there is change in the propensity to consume. First tab I have is a couple of pages in, which reads, an increment of investment in term of wage units cannot occur unless the public are prepared to increase their savings in term of wage units. Ordinarily speaking, the public will not do this unless their aggregate income in terms of wage units is increasing. Thus, their effort to consume a part of their increased incomes will stimulate output until the new level and distribution of incomes provides a margin of savings sufficient to correspond with the increased investment. The multiplier tells us by how much their employment has to be increased to yield an increase in real income sufficient to induce them to do the necessary extra saving, and is a function of their psychological propensities. That footnote says to the psychological propensities, though in more generalized case, it is also a function of the physical conditions of production in the investment and consumption industries, respectively. When full employment is reached, any attempt to increase investment still further will set up a tendency in money prices to rise without limit irrespective of the marginal propensity to consume, i.e., we shall have reached a state of true inflation. Up to this point, however, rising prices will be associated with an increasing aggregate real income. So whenever people think that their income is going up, the prices are going to go up as well. So rising prices will be associated with an increasing aggregate real income. And the aggregate real income is affected by legislation that dictates a higher minimum wage. That does become part of the aggregate. And so my next tab is several pages later, right before part 2 of chapter 11, actually. So we skip that, and that takes us to book 4, the inducement to invest. Starting to get a little juicy. Chapter 11, the marginal efficiency of capital. This is where he starts going a little harder. All right, he purchases the right to the series of prospective returns is when a man buys an investment or capital assets. The series of annuities Q1, Q2 ad infinitum, it is convenient to call the prospective yield of the investment, right? So like if you were buying a business or a blue chip stock, you're buying the future cash flows of that business, and that has value. I would, however, ask the reader to note at once that neither the knowledge of an asset's prospective yield nor the knowledge of the marginal efficiency of the asset enables us to deduce either the rate of interest or the present value of the asset. We must ascertain the rate of interest from some other source. And then can we value the asset by capitalizing its prospective yield. The marginal productivity or yield of efficiency or utility of capital are familiar terms which we have all frequently used. But it is not easy by searching the literature of economics to find a clear statement of what economists have usually intended by these terms. There is, to begin with, the ambiguity whether we are concerned with the increment of physical product per unit of time due to the employment of one more physical unit of capital, or with the increment of value due to the employment of one more value unit of capital, right? So like human capital, right? Your labor is capital to the company, value of unit of capital. So value can be created too with the capital and an increase in capital. Although he does not call it the marginal efficiency of capital, Professor Irving Fisher has given us in his Theory of Interest, 1930, a definition of what he calls the rate of return over cost, which is identical with my definition. The rate of return over cost, he writes, is the rate which employed in computing the present worth of all the cost and the present worth of all returns will make these two equal. Professor Fisher explains that the extent of investment in any direction will depend on comparison between the rate of return over cost and the rate of interest. Those are very important to consider when making decisions. Part 3, changes in the value of money influences the volume of current output. The expectation of a fall in the value of money stimulates investment and hence employment generally, i.e. the investment demand schedule, because it raises the schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital, i.e. the investment demand schedule. And the expectation of a rise in the value of money is depressing because it lowers the schedule of marginal efficiency of capital. The truth which lies behind Professor Irving Fisher's theory of what he originally called appreciation and interest. And then further down, I've tabbed and highlighted that the mistake lies in supposing that it is the rate of interest on which prospective change in the value of money will directly react. Instead of the marginal efficiency of a given stock of capital, prices of existing assets will always adjust themselves to changes in expectation concerning the prospective value of money. The significance of such changes in expectation lies in their effect on the readiness to produce new assets through their reaction on the marginal efficiency of capital. The stimulating effect of the expectation of higher prices is due not to its raising the rate of interest. That would be a paradoxical way of stimulating output. Insofar as the rate of interest rises, the stimulating effect is to that extent offset, but to its raising the marginal efficiency of a given stock of capital. So raising the efficiency of a given stock of capital. So like the machinery, the human, whatever's providing the capital, the labor, the value. If the rate of interest were to rise pari passu with the marginal efficiency of capital, there would be no stimulating effect from the expectation of rising prices. For the stimulus to output depends on the marginal efficiency of a given stock of capital rising relatively to the rate of interest. Indeed, Professor Fisher's theory could be best rewritten in terms of a real rate of interest, defined as being the rate of interest which would have to rule, consequently, on a change in the state of expectation as to the future value of money in order that this change should have no effect on current output. So he's essentially saying that the rate of interest, the value that we place on wages, the value we place on money is all very psychological. And we come to agree on this as a society. To wrap up the chapter before entering chapter 12, I've highlighted and tabbed, it is by reason of the existence of durable equipment that the economic future is linked to the present. It is therefore consonant with and agreeable to our broad principles of thought that the expectation of the future should affect the present through through the demand price for durable equipment. All right, so let's keep in mind durable equipment as we move through. Chapter 12, the state of long-term expectation. In this chapter, we shall consider in more detail some of the factors which determine the prospective yield of an asset. In that first tab on the very next page, part 2, it would be foolish in forming our expectations to attach great weight to matters which are very uncertain. It is reasonable, therefore, to be guided to a considerable degree by the facts about which we feel somewhat confident, even though they may be less decisively relevant to the issue than other facts about which our knowledge is vague and scanty. For this reason, the facts of the existing situation enter, in a sense, disproportionately into the formation of our long-term expectations, our usual practice being to take the existing situation and project it into the future. Okay, so we do this psychologically to take the existing situation and project it into the future. This is an important concept to hold on to. The state of long-term expectation upon which our decisions are based does not solely depend, therefore, on the most probable forecast we can make. It also depends on the confidence with which we make this forecast. The state of confidence, as they term it, is a matter to which practical men always pay the closest and most anxious attention, but the economists have not analyzed it carefully. And so this is what he's just pointing out, that like when you're a business owner or you're an employee or wherever you're at in life, your state of confidence about the future and your ability to achieve that future has a major effect, is what he's saying. So let's just take that and realize, right, that your dreams do and will and can come true if you pursue them. The effect of changes in the rate of interest is, however, easily superimposed on the effect of changes in the state of confidence. Key 3. In fact, those who seriously attempt to make any such estimate are often so much in the minority that their behavior does not govern the market. In former times, when enterprises, so just remember, like, people who still like try to change things, they're still in the minority. You don't have to listen to everybody. In former times, when enterprises were mainly owned by those who undertook them or by their friends and associates, investment depended on a sufficient supply of individuals of sanguine temperament and constructive impulses who embarked on business as a way of life, not really relying on a precise calculation of prospective profit, right? So they just, the enterprises that came to be were like just a group of individuals who came together for the good of the enterprise. They came together and started playing the game of business. And that's what they did, and they worked together. The affair was partly a lottery, but with the ultimate result largely governed by whether the abilities and character of the managers were above or below the average. So that's why you need to put together a team of above average players, is because the law of large numbers, mean distribution, everything like that, it all plays out. And they're not really relying on a precise calculation of prospective profit, right? So take your business plan to the bank. Take your numbers, projections, be analytical, come in with a model. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. What matters is how well you work together as a team. Your culture and commitment to each other is going to dominate any sort of practical sense of the game, essentially. And we just did Taigong's 6 secret teachings, and we just learned that it's the general who hesitates in battle is lost. You have to be confident. Some would fail and some would succeed. But even after the event, no one would know whether the average results in terms of the sums invested had exceeded, equaled, or fallen short of the prevailing rate of interest. Though, if we exclude the exploitation of natural resources and monopolies, it is probable the actual average results of investments, even during periods of progress and prosperity, have disappointed the hopes which prompted them. Businessmen played a mixed game of skill and chance, the average results of which to the players are not known by those who take a hand. Okay, average results. And businessmen playing a mixed game of skill and chance. And I would just say that chance, right, is when luck meets opportunity. When chance is when preparation meets opportunity, right? Luck is when preparation meets opportunity, chance. And so when chance happens, are you prepared to turn it into an opportunity, right? I learned a lot about this from reading Naomi's book, Disaster Capitalism, or she talks about disaster capitalism in the book, The Shock Doctrine. It's a great book. But the stock exchange revalues many investments every day, and the revaluations give a frequent opportunity to the individual, in parentheses, though not to the community as a whole, to revise his commitments. Okay, so this is important. The stock exchange gives a lot of leverage to the individual investor. The individual investor may still be out of luck, but with a little bit of preparation, opportunity, well-readedness, right? Like Warren Buffett, we can make things happen. We don't have to rely on the law of averages. The law of averages can take too long. Thus, certain classes of investment are governed by the average expectation of those who deal on the stock exchange, as revealed in the price of shares, rather than by the genuine expectations of the professional entrepreneur. The subtitle to this says, "This does not apply, of course, to classes of enterprise which are not readily marketable or to which no negotiable instrument closely corresponds." The categories falling within this exception were formerly extensive, but measured as a proportion of the total value of new investment, they are rapidly declining in importance. Okay, so businesses which are not marketable or have like no negotiable instrument closely corresponds. So like there is an exception to the expectations of the professional entrepreneur. You still have to be realistic and you still have to be grounded in logic, but the expectations can be above average and you can be above average, but you have to work and you have to be aware and you have to put in the effort. Part 4, Chapter 12, about the state of long-term expectation. The essence of this convention lies in assuming that the existing state of affairs will continue indefinitely. We know from extensive experience that this is most unlikely. Our behavior, by arguing that to a man in a state of ignorance, errors in either direction are equally probable, right? So like this is a great callback to wartime, COVID, national emergency. Our behavior is dictated kind of by our expectations and what we're told. He's saying here that like if you started telling a man in ignorance, in a state of ignorance, it's equally probable he could decide either way for or against you, right? Depending on what it is. So that there remains a mean actuarial expectation based on equal probabilities. For it can easily be shown that the assumption of arithmetically equal probabilities based on a state of ignorance leads to absurdities. I highlighted that. Okay, so for it can easily be shown that the assumption of arithmetically equal probabilities based on a state of ignorance leads to absurdities. Like you can't be ignorant about things if you're going to make a decision, if you're going to talk about them, you have to read about them, you have to learn them, you have to be knowledgeable in them, you have to practice, right? You have to iterate within, that framework. Philosophically speaking, it cannot be uniquely correct, since our existing knowledge does not provide a sufficient basis for a calculated mathematical expectation. In point of fact, all sorts of considerations into the market valuation which are in no way relevant to the perspective. What I'm hearing him say from that is like the efficient market hypothesis is a great hypothesis, but it's not practical in reality. In fact, even if we did have, and we've seen this now through phenomenon like GameStop, that it doesn't really matter. The fundamentals aren't there. The people's expectation is dictating the market. And so part 5 is like he's starting to talk about some of the factors which accentuate this precariousness. Number 2 is day-to-day fluctuations in the profits of existing investments, which are obviously of an ephemeral and non-significant character, tend to have an altogether excessive and even absurd influence on the market. If you've ever day traded like I have, you are able to see the charts, you follow the drama of the day of the market in a sense. You start to get a feel, these fluctuations. And he's saying they're ephemeral and non-significant, but they have an absurd influence on the market. And this is very true. Like a 10-cent jump, a 5-cent jump can have major fluctuations because it could signal somebody into some form of irrational spiral. Number 4, but there's one feature in particular which deserves our attention. It might have been supposed that competition between expert professionals possessing judgment and knowledge beyond that of the average private investor would correct the vagaries of the ignorant individual left to himself. This is expected and assumed. It happens, however, that the energies and skills of the professional investor and speculator are mainly occupied otherwise. That is kind of like the assumption, is that we have more knowledge as a firm, right, as the big bad investment guru giant that is on every corner and on the commercials during the big game. But at the end of the day, the professional investor and the speculator, they're not concerned with the long-term forecast or the long-term profit, right? They're trying to get the quick scalp, not trying to make a decision based on the whole life of the investment, but with foreseeing changes in the conventional basis of valuation a short time ahead of the public. Okay, that's what they're concerned with, is anticipating and having a little bit of knowledge before the general public. That's what speculators do. They are concerned not with what an investment is really worth to a man who buys it for keeps, but with what the market will value it at under the influence of mass psychology 3 months or a year hence. Think about that. Like he's just putting into words some of the phenomenon that we're seeing with these meme stocks. How many of these other influencers out there have actually read an economics book from Keynes, like talking about this back in the 1930s? The social object of skilled investment should be to defeat the dark forces of time and ignorance which envelop our future. This is like the whole thing behind my investment philosophy. He's laying out that we expect things to go normal, right? These companies, they're public, they have expectations, they give us their quarterly financials, and people just start assuming that the big ones are going to keep going on in perpetuity, and they're buying that dividend, right? They're buying the value over time. That's what they're investing in. And so the object of anybody's portfolio is to defeat the dark forces of like time and ignorance, right? Because we can't be on top of everything. And inflation is a killer, and time weakens us because we are only human. And so the goal of any good investment strategy is to combat this exactly, is to find your lifestyle and to put you and purchase things and stocks that you're agreeable with and are going to help pay you in that dividend in order to grow that value of your personal portfolio over time, right? In order to fight the dark forces of time, okay? Because like we've got all the things out there, everything that's a distraction, right? I have my weaknesses that I spend my money on, whether it's video games, books from the used bookstore that I never quite get to reading, starting off a hobby or maybe a tool that I think I need for work, right? I've made these justifications of where I should invest my money when maybe there was a better choice in some form of stock or something like that. But then again, the wise, asset manager, he's not going to speculate on everything. He is going to make these decisions based on long-term strategy and short-term strategies. Further down the page, I've highlighted, we have reached the third degree where we devote our intelligences to anticipating what average opinion expects the average opinion to be. And how is that not so true? Like that is just personified almost in the GameStop saga, I think. We expect the hedge fund to keep doing the thing. We've exposed these synthetic shares. We expect, that most people aren't going to get in. And so when most people aren't going to buy in because it's a gamble, then we're expecting that when the shorts do come, that us, we're holding strong. Investment based on genuine long-term expectation is so difficult today as to be scarcely practical. I'm just going to say that again because this is in 1930. He's saying investment based on genuine long-term expectations is so difficult today as to be scarcely practical. He who attempts it must surely lead much more laborious days and run greater risk than he who tries to guess better than the crowd how the crowd will behave. Given equal intelligence, he may make more disastrous mistakes. There is no clear evidence from experience that the investment policy which is socially advantageous coincides with which is most profitable. Doesn't say that there's clear evidence, but he is saying that there is pretty much clear evidence based on long-term expectations. They're always going to go wrong. How many times have we seen the market fluctuate in certain patterns and cycles only when people are retiring? They've worked their whole life. They've had these laborious days and they're running greater risks to work and work and work and save and scrimp when they should be taking other appropriate risks. I just thought that was just very powerful that he pointed that out, and that is in 1930. Is that maybe a feeling that he had because it was, a little bit post-Depression era in the stock market crash? Or, right, just a observance over time, which it very well could have been. A book like this does not get written overnight. There is a peculiar zest in making money quickly, I highlighted. And they're just so true. Like, quick money is very zesty. It's a very zesty way to live life, especially if you studied and labored, right? Like that time does have value. Researched a company, you've looked at the 10K, the 8K, the quarterly financial, you've calculated, is this dividend great? What is this company and what is this sector going to be like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now? Or you do kind of like catch the tip of the inside thing happening and it's like not quite released, but then you find out through the news and then boom, it happens. I'm just saying that there's a zest to that. For it is the essence of behavior that he should be eccentric, unconventional, and rash in the eyes of average opinion. If he is successful, that will only confirm the general belief in his rashness. Worldly wisdom teaches us that it is better for reputation to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally. And I just love that. I love how he's defending rashness is seen a certain way because of the mean distribution of people, right? Having an above average effort put into your investment decisions might seem rash because they just don't put in the same amount of effort into choosing those companies. But you did, and it paid off. Worldly wisdom teaches us that it is better for your reputation to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally. So it doesn't matter what the heck people say about you. You're making the decisions based on your logic and your reasoning. And this is why I think so many people who go through psychology degrees are so wildly successful. And one of the many reasons I love it as just a hobby of reading, studying. A collapse in the price of equities, which has had disastrous reactions on the marginal efficiency of capital, may have been due to the weakening either of speculative confidence or of the state of credit. And I think that's very important because look at where we're at. We have high credit and a lot of speculation. But whereas the weakening of either is enough to cause a collapse, recovery requires the revival of both. As an American, if you're an entrepreneur, what you should be doing is going to war every day, fighting for this. You have to have confidence and you have to be able to repay your credit. Credit can be a beautiful thing, but pay it back. Have a plan to pay it back. Have the skills to pay it back. We need to revive the speculation and we need to bolster the credit. If I may be allowed to appropriate the term speculation for the activity of forecasting the psychology of the market, the term enterprise for the activity of forecasting the prospective yields of assets over their whole life, it is by no means always the case that speculation predominates over enterprise. As the organization of investment markets improves, the risk of the predominance of speculation does, however, increase. In one of the greatest investment markets in the world, namely New York, the influence of speculation in the above sense is enormous. Even outside the field of finance, Americans are apt to unduly be interested in discovering what average opinion believes average opinion to believe and be, and this national weakness finds its nemesis in the stock market. It is rare, one is told, for an American to invest, as many Englishmen still do, for income. There's so much power to dividend investing. Speculators may do no harm as bubbles on a steady stream of enterprise, but the position is serious when enterprise becomes the bubble on a whirlpool of speculation. Okay, this is very important right now because Nvidia is huge. And disclaimer, I own it. So biased advice or not, right? Speculators may do no harm as bubbles as a steady stream of enterprise. Okay, the speculators on Nvidia, they're not causing any problems. All of this enterprise around Nvidia is happening. Data centers, the demand, supply, it all lines up. This is the reason I got into it years ago, and it came true a few quarters later, namely 3 or 4 years. And we're still seeing the same numbers, the same demand, the same rise, the same hype. At what point is it speculation? At what point is it not? Because the infrastructure is there. Digital life is happening. People are on their computers, their tablets all the time. The chipsets are very important, especially as the world becomes more robotic and there's more equipment being made, more robots being made to do capital. A lot of things are going to be changing with these definition of what is real income and the wage unit, right? Especially if we have more and more industrial revolutionary types of robots coming to assist with our work. Part 7. There's a lot highlighted here, and guys, we're now getting into a lot of it. We're over, I'd say we're just about halfway done, and so this is where it starts getting pretty thick and juicy, and he starts really dropping some fire. All right. Even apart from the instability due to speculation, there is the instability due to the characteristic of human nature that the large proportion of our positive activities depend on spontaneous optimism rather than on mathematical expectation, whether moral or hedonistic or economic. Most probably of our decisions to do something positive, the full consequences of which will be drawn out over many days to come, can only be taken as a result of animal spirits, of a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, not as the outcome of a weighted average of quantitative benefits multiplied by quantitative probabilities. The instability due to that characteristic of human nature, our positive activities is spontaneous optimism, just feeling good. You can't measure that. You just can't measure that. Thus, if the animal spirits are dimmed and the spontaneous optimism falters, leaving us to depend on nothing but a mathematical expectation, enterprise will fade and die. It is safe to say that enterprise, which depends on hopes stretching into the future, benefits the community as a whole. Economic prosperity is excessively dependent on a political and social atmosphere which is congenial to the average businessman. Slumps and depression are exaggerated to a certain degree, but also that economic prosperity is dependent on the political and social atmosphere, and it has to be nice to the average businessman, congenial, as it were. So it has to be a good environment for us to operate in, and without a good environment, we're not as hopeful, and without the hope, we're not as hedonistic, and we don't do spontaneous good things, and those spontaneous good things often flow to 501(c)(3)s or 501(c)(19)s, 501(c)(3)s, any kind of organization. Is that hopeful optimism, right? We must have regard, therefore, to the nerves and hysteria, and even the digestions and reactions to the weather of those upon whose spontaneous activity it largely ends. So if Elon Musk is going to do something spontaneous, a large percentage is going to depend on that. We're going to have a real discussion as humanity if he did something spontaneous, right? And then there would be all kinds of speculators on top of that, and that would be okay, and that would create arise. We are merely reminding ourselves that human decisions affecting the future, whether personal or political or economic, cannot depend on strict mathematical expectation. And a lot of us do this. We rationalize away and we think that, well, the math and the law of large numbers will play out, but we always forget the miracle and the hope, baby. Since the basis for making such calculations does not exist, and that it is our innate urge to activity which makes the wheels go round. Our rational selves choosing between the alternatives as best we are able, calculating where we can, but often falling back for our motive on a whim or sentiment or chance. Part 8. In the case of the most important class of very long-term investments, namely buildings, the risk can be frequently transferred from investor to the occupier, or at least shared between them by means of long-term contracts. Occupier by the advantages of continuity and security of tenure. The other important class of long-term investments, public utilities. This is why it's important to consider, right, why internet should or should not be a public utility, like the phone lines, like water, like electricity. The reason, one of the only ways to win monopoly is to own the utilities. And that's because the prospective yield is practically guaranteed by monopoly privileges coupled with the right to charge such rates. So you have to pay for water, electric, these are public utilities, right? The utility companies. If there's a way to invest in it through like city bonds and things like that, like these are solid, great choices for investments, which are frankly influenced in making the investment by a general presumption of there being prospective social advantages from the investment. Just talking about public authorities making investments. He wraps up chapter 12 with, only experience, however, can show how far management of the rate of interest is capable of continuously stimulating the appropriate volume of investment. For my own part, I am now somewhat skeptical of the success of a merely monetary policy directed towards influencing the rate of interest. He says, I expect to see the state, which is in a position to calculate the marginal efficiency of capital goods on long views on the basis of the general social advantage, taking an ever greater responsibility for directly organizing investment. So he just thinks that the state is going to have to step in more and more and more. On to chapter 13, the general theory of the rate of interest. To complete our theory, therefore, we need to know what determines the rate of interest. And he spends the whole chapter defining interest. My first tab and major highlight, thus the rate of interest at any time, being the reward for parting with liquidity, is a measure of the unwillingness of those who possess money to part with their liquid control over it. The rate of interest is not the price which brings into equilibrium the demand for resources to invest with the readiness to abstain from present consumption. It is the price which equilibrates the desire to hold wealth in the form of cash with the available quantity of cash, which implies that if the rate of interest were lower, for example, if the reward for parting with cash were diminished, the aggregate amount of cash which the public would wish to hold would exceed the available supply, and that if the rate of interest were raised, there would be a surplus of cash which no one would be willing to hold. If this explanation is correct, the quantity of money is the other factor, which is in conjunction with liquidity preference, determines the actual rate of interest in given circumstances. Okay, and he gets really technical, starts talking about liquidity preference, but I want to focus on the fact that a lower rate of interest is going to increase the supply. But if the rate of interest was raised, people don't want to have any surplus cash. And that, like, as an entrepreneur, as someone who has received cash payments, you don't want to keep it. You want to divest it immediately. The interest rates are very high right now. This is where and how the quantity of money enters into the economic scheme, talking about liquidity preference. So for the first two uses, it's obvious that up to a point, it is worthwhile to sacrifice a certain amount of interest for the convenience of liquidity. But given that the rate of interest is never negative, why should anyone prefer to hold his wealth in a form which yields little or no interest to holding it in a form which yields interest? Cash is cash, whether it's invested in a stock, whether it's in a savings account or a checking account or in your hand. The assumption is that people want to hold it where it bears gaining interest. And so right now and how he said earlier, there's a massive quantity of money that's been printed and put into circulation. It tends to go to investment, right? Like that's why so many people who are doing really well now from investing in Bitcoin with their stimulus check, they made that decision. They had a surplus cash, the fiat currency got weakened, and they put it in investment, which is what Keynes talks about will happen to the prudent man will choose to do. It must always be more advantageous to purchase a debt than to hold cash as a store of wealth. So a debt, owning a stock, is kind of like owning a debt of the company. An initial public offering is a public issuance of debt. Okay, so anyway, we don't need to get into the nitty gritty. It's just preferable to own something that appreciates and have your money in something that gains value or pays a dividend or has some other intrinsic form of value other than the greenback, which does not gain interest, which just sits there. Just as we found that the marginal efficiency of capital is fixed, not by the best opinion, but by the market valuation as determined by mass psychology. So also expectations as to the future of the rate of interest is fixed by mass psychology. Whilst the individual who differs from the market in the other direction will have a motive for borrowing money for short periods in order to purchase debts for a longer term. I thought this was very interesting because this is a very good contrarian strategy, especially if you have a solid basis for believing or knowing these fundamentals and kind of anticipating, right, the moves, the mass psychology. We see a lot of investment greats do this same thing. They look around and they are contrarian. They borrow money for short periods, purchase long-term debts. So if I were to tell you that a hindsight strategy, if you anticipated a stock to split, you borrowed on margin, the stock split, it announced that it's splitting, it goes up in value, you borrowed that money, paid it back. Now you have money that you generated from your research. Nevertheless, circumstances can develop in which even a large increase in the quantity of money may exert a comparatively small influence on the rate of interest, or a large increase in the quantity of money may cause so much uncertainty about the future that liquidity preferences due to the security motive may be strengthened, whilst opinion about the future of the rate of interest may be so unanimous that a small change in present rates may cause a mass movement into cash. This is a circumstance, I think, when there has been a large increase in the quantity of money. Right before part 3. But if not, then, if we are to control the activity of the economic system by changing the quantity of money, it is important that opinions should differ. People should have different opinions. Especially if we're going to change the economic system by changing the quantity of money, which is what they did, or trying to do maybe. Thus, this method of control is more precarious in the United States, where everyone tends to hold the same opinion at the same time. Not really true right now, but at the time of writing, yeah, we were much more united. We were very much more united. 3. For whilst an increase in the quantity of money may be expected set par to reduce the rate of interest, this will not happen if the liquidity preference of the public are increasing more than the quantity of money. Okay, so what he's saying here is that an increase in the quantity of money may be expected to reduce the rate of interest, but it will not happen if the liquidity preference, right? People want quick cash and they need it quicker and faster. And if they need it quicker and faster than the quantity of money, there will be no reduction in the rate of interest. People need money fast right now. And if you hang around with enough people who are living outside of their means, you see this. They need that money fast. They can't wait 3 months, 6 months. They can't be on a net 30, a net 45, or a net 90 payment schedule. And this is concerning for a business if you're having to generate so much to keep up and you can't, you can't take your foot off the pedal, so to speak, for what Sun Tzu calls, right, like strategic retreat, strategic rest. And he'll wrap up the chapter by saying the habit of overlooking the relation of the rate of interest to hoarding may be a part of the explanation why interest is usually regarded as the reward of not spending, whereas in fact it is the reward of not hoarding. You are spending. You are buying an asset. You are buying a stock. You are buying a debt. You are not hoarding your cash. You are being rewarded. Chapter 14 is the classical theory of the rate of interest. A couple of tabs here, a couple of charts, not too terribly long until we get to the appendix to chapter 14. So let's breeze through really quick. It must be admitted that an automatic adjustment takes place between saving and the opportunities for employing capital profitably. So that is all he's saying. All he's saying there is that there's adjustment between saving and spending capital for profit with the anticipation and expectation for profit. Certainly the ordinary man, banker, civil servant, or politician brought up on the traditional theory and the trained economist also has carried away with him the idea that whenever an individual performs an act of saving, he has done something which automatically brings down the rate of interest, that this automatically stimulates the output of capital, and that the fall in the rate of interest is just so much as is necessary to stimulate the output of capital to an extent which is equal to the increment of saving. And further, that is a self-regulatory process of adjustment which takes place without the necessity for any special intervention or grandmotherly care on the part of the monetary authority. He's saying the classical takeaway, and what most people believe, is that by saving, you've given money to the bank, you are entrusting the bank to use your money to loan, right, to give to other people for which they are going to charge for that money to generate, when that may not be the best case. Personal experience, better to invest than keep your money in the bank. Indeed, most members of the classical school carry this belief too far, since they held that every act of increased saving by an individual necessarily brings into existence a corresponding act of increased investment. Right? Saving is not investment. Investment is different than saving. Yet no reason has been given why a change in the quantity of money should affect either the investment demand schedule or the readiness to save out of a given income. They have seemed undisturbed by the conflict and have made no attempt, so far as I know, to build a bridge between the two theories. Which, I mean, it's true. These things are very much butting heads, and a lot of people are confused. A lot of people are impoverished. A lot of people don't understand what the heck inflation means. Right? I've spent a lot of time in blue collar service based jobs, and people really just they don't understand a lot of this stuff, and they fall prey to this kind of like academic viewpoint of it based on like a system that was like implemented and placed on us rather than a natural evolution of it. But again, there's the irrational exuberance, there's the optimism, and then there's going to be people who create businesses which have no marketable need, which have no, no ability to sell the product because it just is not the right thing. Anyway, to move on and wrap up this chapter, thus the traditional analysis is faulty because it has failed to isolate correctly the independent variables of the system. Saving and investment are the determinants of the system, not the determinants. They're determinants of the system, not the determinants themselves. They are the twin results of the system's determinants, namely the propensity to consume, the schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital, and the rate of interest. And to wrap up the chapter, the reader will readily appreciate that the problem here under discussion is a matter of the most fundamental theoretical significance and of overwhelming practical importance. I agree, Keynes. I agree, very much so. The economic principle on which the practical advice of economists has been almost invariably based, has assumed in effect that set par, a decrease in spending will tend to lower the rate of interest and an increase in investment will raise it. But what if the two quantities determine not the rate of interest but the aggregate volume of employment? Then our outlook on the mechanism of the economic system will be profoundly changed. You're looking at the wrong variables, he's saying. And maybe you should look at different variables too to make your decisions. A decreased readiness to spend will be looked on in quite a different light if instead of being regarded as a factor which will set par increase investment, it is seen as a factor which will set par diminish employment. Appendix to Chapter 14. Marshall's position on the rate of interest are to be found in his Principles of Economics, the 6th edition, the gist of which is given by the following quotes, and I've just not highlighted all of it, but just a little bit. But interest is being the price paid for the use of capital in any market. And the footnote, I've highlighted more in the footnotes than I have on the page. This assumes that income is not constant, but it is not obvious in what way a rise in the rate of interest will lead to extra work. I would suggest that the sentence should be rewritten insofar, therefore, as the extensive increase in the demand for capital goods cannot immediately be met by an increase in the total stock. It will have to be held in check for the time being by a rise in the supply price of capital goods sufficient to keep the marginal efficiency of capital in equilibrium with the rate of interest without there being any material change in the scale of investment. Professor Pigu's only significant reference to what determines the rate of interest is, I think, to be found in his Industrial Fluctuations, 1st edition, pages 251 to 3, where he controverts the view that the rate of interest, being determined by the general conditions of demand and supply of real capital, lies outside the central or any other bank's control. Real capital lies outside any central bank control. Real capital is your ability to provide sweat equity, build machinery, to own machinery, manufacture the things, right? Like Adam Smith owned the means of production. Owning the means of production is wealth. Land is a means of production, or can be. That is wealth. It is about what you do with the things that you are given. And that is outside of anyone's control. A central bank cannot dictate how or where or what you work on. Only you can. Thus increasing the stream of real capital available for them. Okay, it is like true, in short, that the banker's rate for money is bound by a mechanical tie to the real rate of interest on long loans. Okay. Part 2 of the appendix, the following from his Principles of Political Economy, page 511, puts the substance of Ricardo's theory of the rate of interest, and I've highlighted, but by the rate of profit which can be made by the employment of capital. Bank money then depends on the comparison between the rate of profits that may be made by the employment of it, the employment of the comparison between rate of profits, okay, and the bank money employing it. Okay, this is clear cut that it affords a better starting point for the discussion. They are nevertheless sufficiently uncomfortable about it to seek refuge in haziness. He's basically saying that people who subscribe to the Ricardian doctrine, they're Ricardo himself provides such a clear theory, but the people who parrot him are never sufficiently uncomfortable, and they're happy to be, hazy about it. They're not able to really put their finger on anything. For investment is stimulated either by a raising of the schedule, the marginal efficiency, or by a lowering of the rate of interest. It has been suggested by some economists that the net effect of reduced spending will be a lower price level of consumers' goods than would otherwise have been the case, and that, in consequence, stimulus to investment and fixed capital would thereby tend to be minimized. This view, however, is incorrect. Basically, the stimulus to invest and fix capital has been taught that it was not a good idea, whereas that's not true. Fixed capital can be a great thing if you produce with it. Chapter 15, the psychological and business incentives to liquidity. I highlighted starting out the income velocity of money. It may be a symptom of decreased liquidity preference. The income velocity of money, right? Kind of what we were just talking about, the speed in which people need money to spend. In chapter 13, he introduces a transactions motive, which can be further classified as the income motive and the business motive, the precautionary motive and the speculative motive. And then he goes on to break down these motives. So let's dive on in. The income motive. One reason for holding cash is to bridge the interval between the receipt of income and its disbursement. The strength of this motive is in inducing a decision to hold a given aggregate of cash will chiefly depend on the amount of income and the normal length of the interval between its receipt and disbursement. It is in this connection that the concept of the income velocity of money is strictly appropriate. The business motive. Similarly, cash is held to bridge the interval of time between incurring business cost and that of the receipt of the sale of proceeds. Cash held by dealers to bridge the interval between purchase and realization being included under this heading. The strength of this demand will chiefly depend on the value of current output and hence on current income and on the number of hands through which output passes, how many employees are required, okay? The precautionary motive 3, to provide for contingencies requiring sudden expenditure and for unforeseen opportunities of advantageous purchases, right? A great reason to have cash in your portfolio for when the market's dead cat bounce, and also to hold an asset of which the value is fixed in terms of money to meet a subsequent liability fixed in terms of money, or further motives for holding cash. The strengths of all these three types of motives will partly depend on the cheapness and the reliability of methods of obtaining cash. How reliable can you get cash? I wonder how long that froze for. For there is no necessity to hold idle cash to bridge over intervals if it can be obtained without difficulty at the moment when it is actually required. So how easy is it to get cash? Is it easy? Is it hard? This is going to determine a lot of these motives. 4, there remains the speculative motive. This needs a more detailed examination than the others, both because it is less well understood and because it is particularly important in transmitting the effects of a change in the quantity of money. In normal circumstances, the amount of money required to satisfy the transactions motive and the precautionary motive is mainly a result of the general activity of the economic system and the level of money income. But it is by playing on the speculative motive that monetary management, or in the absence of management, chance changes in the quantity of money, is brought to bear on the economic system. Indeed, if this were not so, open market operations would be impractical. It is, however, important to distinguish between the changes in the rate of interest, which are due to changes in the supply of money available to satisfy the speculative motive, right? Important as far as a lot of the speculators and what's happened and what we've seen as of late. Nevertheless, it is a change in the rate of interest rather than the redistribution of cash which deserves our main attention. Moreover, even in the general case, the shift in the rate of interest is usually the most prominent part of the reaction to change in the news, which is as it should be, in view of individuals being much more similar than they are dissimilar in their reaction to news. We're so similar in our reaction to news, he says. Is that so different today? How do we react to news? It is evident then that the rate of interest is a highly psychological phenomenon. And he says we find this out more in book 5, okay? But at the level above the rate which corresponds to full employment, the long-term market rate of interest will depend not only on the current policy of the monetary authority, but also on the market expectations concerning its future policy. That's why Fed minutes of the meeting are my Super Bowl, baby. That is what decides my decisions in a lot of ways, right? Being the average of the person, right? The people, right? Anyway, kind of like what he talks about, but you have to pay attention. You have to know where to place yourself. You have to be able to go play that game, place yourself in that mindset in order to make another decision looking in on that mindset. It might be more accurate, perhaps, to say that the rate of interest is a highly conventional rather than a highly psychological phenomenon, for its actual value is largely governed by the prevailing view as to what its value is expected to be. Any level of interest which is accepted with sufficient conviction will be durable, subject, of course, in a changing society to fluctuations for all kinds of reasons around the expected normal, okay? velocity of money, the M and the M1 and the rate of interest and vice versa. It is going to fluctuate. The difficulties in the way of maintaining effective demand at a level high enough to provide full employment, which ensue from the association of a conventional and fairly stable long-term rate of interest with a fickle and highly unstable marginal efficiency of capital, should be by now obvious to the reader. Another tab. Thus, there are certain limitations on the ability of the monetary authority to establish any given complex rates of interest for debts of different terms and risks, which can be summed up as follows. 1. There are those limitations which arise out of the monetary authority's own practices in limiting its willingness to deal to debts of a particular type. 2. There is the possibility, for the reasons discussed above, that after the rate of interest has fallen to a certain level, liquidity preference may become virtually absolute, in the sense that almost everyone prefers cash to holding a debt which yields so low a rate of interest. In this event, the monetary authority would have lost effective control over the rate of interest. But whilst this limiting case might become practically important in future, I know of no example of it hitherto. If everyone started holding a particular currency over any kind of company or anything like that, any kind of stock, any kind of debt, the monetary control wouldn't have any authority. But whilst this limiting case might be particularly important in the future, indeed, owing to the unwillingness of most monetary authorities to deal boldly in debts of long term, they don't. They only have short-term band-aids. There has not been much opportunity for a test. Moreover, if such a situation were to arise, it would mean that the public authority itself could borrow through the banking system on an unlimited scale and at a nominal rate of interest. Bailouts. The most striking example of a complete breakdown of the stability in the rate of interest due to the liquidity function flattening out in one direction or the other have occurred in very abnormal circumstances. In Russia and Central Europe after the war, a currency crisis or flight from the currency was experienced when no one could be induced to retain holdings either of money or of debts on any terms whatever, and even a high and rising rate of interest was unable to keep pace with the marginal efficiency of capital, especially stocks of liquid goods, under the influence of the expectation of an ever greater fall in the value of money. Whilst the U.S. at certain dates in 1932 there was a crisis of the opposite kind, a financial crisis or crisis of liquidation, when scarcely anyone could be induced to part with the holdings of money on any reasonable terms. There is finally the difficulty discussed in sections 4 of chapter 11 part 1 page 125 in the way of bringing the effective rate of interest below a certain figure, which may prove important in an era of low interest rates, namely the intermediate cost of bringing the borrower and the ultimate lender together, and the allowance for risk, especially for moral right, which the lender requires over and above the pure rate of interest. As the pure rate of interest declines, it does not follow that the allowances for expenses and risks decline pari passu. Thus, the rate of interest which the typical borrower has to pay may decline more slowly than the pure rate of interest, and may be incapable of being brought by the methods of the existing banking and financial organization below a certain minimum figure. This is particularly important if the estimation of moral risk is appreciable, or where the risk is due to doubt in the mind of the lender concerning the honesty of the borrower. There is nothing in the mind of a borrower who does not intend to be dishonest to offset the resultant higher charge. It is also important in the case of short-term loans, i.e. bank loans, where the expenses are heavy, a bank may have to charge its customers 1.5% to 2%, even if the pure rate of interest to the lender is nil. He wraps up with part 4, which leads us into chapter 16. Chapter 16, Sundry Observations on the Nature of Capital. My first highlight is on page 183. It comes from believing that the owner of wealth desires a capital asset as such, whereas what he really desires is its prospective yield. He says it's a fallacy that is most difficult to disabuse men's minds. Now, prospective yield wholly depends on the expectation of future effective demand in relation to future conditions of supply. Basically, what he's saying is the wealth owner and the owner of wealth, what he wants is prospective yield. Not really a capital asset as such, but what can the capital asset produce? And the current rate of interest depends, as we have seen, not on the strength of the desire to hold wealth, but on the strengths of the desires to hold it in liquid and illiquid forms, respectively. On page 185, I've got a couple of bricks highlighted here. I sympathize therefore with the pre-classical doctrine that everything is produced by labor, aided by what used to be called art is now called technique, by natural resources which are free or cost or rent according to their scarcity or abundance, and by the results of past labor embodied in assets which also command a price according to their scarcity or abundance. It is preferable to regard labor, including of course the personal services of the entrepreneur and his assistants, as the sole factor of production operating in a given environment of technique, natural resources, capital equipment, and effective demand. This partly explains why we have been able to take the unit of labor as the sole physical unit which we require in our economic system, apart from units of money and of time. So again, this is what's really important about this book and part of his argument. This partly explains why we have been able to take the unit of labor as the sole physical unit which we require in our economic system. It is true that some lengthy or roundabout processes are physically efficient, but so are some short processes. Lengthy processes are not physically efficient because they are long. Some, probably most, lengthy processes would be physically very inefficient, for there are such things as spoiling or wasting with time. Moreover, there are all sorts of reasons why various kinds of services and facilities are scarce and therefore expensive relatively to the quantity of labor involved. For example, smelly processes command a higher reward because people will not undertake them otherwise. So do risky processes. But we do not devise a productivity theory of smelly or risky processes as such. In short, not all labor is accomplished in equally agreeable attendant circumstances. To me, this says, if you want to make money, go do things that other people don't want to do. Everyone's out here trying to be an actor, trying to be an influencer, trying to do this, trying to do that, trying to be a marketer, right? Sit in an air-conditioned office. But the thing is you have to do things that other people don't want to do at the base level of labor and output in order to accumulate any sort of actual physical real money, right? The real currency, the real, like a real wage unit. But the optimum amount itself should be as such as to provide. So this is basically saying the risky processes, the stinky processes, the things that people don't want to do, that's what you have to do in order to get a real wage. The supply and demand holds true even in the labor market. But the optimum amount itself should be as such to provide at the appropriate dates for that part of consumers' demand which it is desired to defer. In optimum conditions, that is to say, production should be so organized as to produce in the most efficient manner compatible with delivery at the dates at which consumers' demand is expected to become effective. This is basically case study and why Amazon became what it became, because people thought that things could arrive, and then as shipping became more and more efficient and someone worked to create a more efficient process in the system, they gained the market share. Thus, for a society such as we have supposed, the position of equilibrium under conditions of laissez-faire will be one in which employment is low enough and the standard of life sufficiently miserable to bring savings to zero. More probably, there will be a cyclical movement round this equilibrium position. For if there is still room for uncertainty about the future, the marginal efficiency of capital will occasionally rise above zero, leading to a boom. And then finally, he says, this disturbing conclusion depends, of course, on the assumption that the propensity to consume and the rate of investment are not deliberately controlled in the social interest, but are mainly left to influences of laissez-faire. It is not reasonable, however, that a sensible community should be content to remain dependent on such fortuitous and often wasteful mitigations when once we understand the influences upon which effective demand depends. If I am right in supposing it to be comparatively easy to make capital goods so abundant that the marginal efficiency of capital is zero, this may be the most sensible way of gradually getting rid of many objectionable features of capitalism. Capital goods are so abundant, the marginal efficiency is zero. There's no marginal efficiency left. This is going to be a way to get rid of objectionable features of capitalism. Thus, unless the pure rate of interest were to be held at a negative figure, there would still be a positive yield to skilled investment in individual assets having a doubtful prospective yield. Provided there was some measurable unwillingness to undertake risk, there would also be a positive net yield from the aggregate of such assets over a period of time. Interesting stuff. I love it. It's very deep, very thought-provoking, especially in the context of the whole book. Highly recommend reading it. For the Armchair Economist, there are three attributes which different types of assets possess in different degrees, namely as follows. And this is, we're now in chapter 17, essential properties of interest and money. The three attributes are as follows. Some assets produce a yield or output, which he denotes with the variable Q, measured in terms of themselves by assisting some process or production or supplying services to a consumer. You, a person, you can be an asset that produces a yield or an output, right, by assisting a process or production or supplying a service to a consumer. You make a widget that is then bought by another company to be included in their widget. Most assets, except money, suffer from some wastage or involve some cost through the mere passage of time, apart from any change in their relative value, irrespective of their being used to produce a yield, i.e. they involve a carrying cost, C, measured in terms of themselves. It It does not matter for our present purpose exactly where we draw the line between the costs which we deduct before calculating Q and which we include in C, since in what follows shall be exclusively concerned with Q minus C. Finally, the power of disposal over an asset during a period may offer a potential convenience or security, which is not equal for assets of different kinds. Though the assets themselves are of equal initial value, there is, so to speak, nothing to show for this at the end of the period in the shape of output, yet it is something for which people are ready to pay something. So this is like the intrinsic value, the power of disposal for convenience or security. These don't have anything. This is just value. People pay for whatever this value is, the amount measured in terms of itself, which they are willing to pay for the potential convenience or security given by the power of disposal, exclusive of yield or carrying cost attaching to the asset. We shall call it liquidity premium, or L. 198. We cannot get out of our difficulties, as some have supposed, merely by decreeing that wheat or houses shall be the standard of value instead of gold or sterling. For it now appears that the same difficulties will ensue if there continues to exist any asset of which the own rate of interest is reluctant to decline as output increases. It may be, for example, that gold will continue to fill this role in a country which has gone over an inconvertible paper standard, which is interesting. In the 1930s, and now we're on a we're no longer on that standard. And it's an inconvertible paper standard, which we are on now. Part 3. And Bitcoin has almost become like gold. Almost. In attributing, therefore, a peculiar significance to the money rate of interest, we have been tacitly assuming that the kind of money to which we are accustomed has some special characteristics which lead to its own rate of interest in terms of itself as standard, being more reluctant to fall as output increases than the own rates of interest of any other assets in terms of themselves. Is this assumption justified? Reflection shows, I think, that the following peculiarities which commonly characterize money as we know it are capable of justifying it. The first characteristic, I've only highlighted the elasticity of production, meaning in this context the response of the quantity of labor applied to producing it to a rise in the quantity of labor which a unit of it will command. If the price of other assets was tending to fall in terms of money, more labor would be diverted into the production of money, as we see to be the case in gold mining countries. An increase in the commodity rates of money interest and is therefore stimulating to the output of other assets. Then he is on theoretical grounds. This reaction might be capable of allowing. There are, however, several reasons which taken in combination are of compelling force. Why an economy of the type to which we are accustomed, it is very probable that the money rate of interest will often prove reluctant to decline adequately. We have to allow, first of all, for the reactions of a fall in the wage unit on the marginal efficiencies of other assets in terms of money, for it is the difference between these and the money rate of interest which we are concerned. Okay, the wage unit, the efficiency of the wage unit, the difference between this and the money rate. This is what we're worried about. If the effect of the fall in the wage unit is to produce an expectation that it will subsequently rise again, the result will be wholly favorable. If, on the contrary, the effect is to produce an expectation of a further fall, the reaction on the marginal efficiency of capital may offset the decline in the rate of interest. So a lot of people have gotten lazy. The wage unit has been distorted. The marginal efficiency of capital is terrible. And so anyway, that's the way that I see it now for 2024. The fact that wages tend to be sticky in terms of money, the money wage being more stable than the real wage, tends to limit the readiness of the wage unit to fall in terms of money. Moreover, if this were not so, the position might be worse rather than better, because if money wages were to fall easily, this might often tend to create an expectation of a further fall with unfavorable reactions on the marginal efficiency of capital. Even to a substantial increase in the quantity of money in proportion to other forms of wealth, in other words, beyond a certain point, money's yields from liquidity does not fall in response to an increase in its quantity to anything approaching the extent to which the yield from other types of assets falls when their quantity is comparatively increased. In the case of money, however, this, as we have seen, is not so, and for a variety of reasons, namely, those which constitute money as being, in the estimation of the public, par excellence, liquid. Thus, those reformers who look for a remedy by creating artificial carrying costs for money through the device of requiring legal tender currency to be periodically stamped at a prescribed cost in order to retain its quality as money, or in analogous ways, have been on the right track, and the practical value of their proposal deserves consideration. Further down, I've highlighted the only relief can come so long as the propensity towards liquidity is unchanged from an increase in the quantity of money, or, which is formally the same thing, a rise in the value of money which enables a given quantity to provide increased money services. And that's kind of the crux of the whole system and the whole situation. You have to either increase the quantity of money or increase the quantity that money can buy. It's easier to increase the quantity of money. The money rate of interest, by setting the pace for all other commodity rates of interest, holds back investment in the production of these other commodities without being capable of stimulating investment for the production of money, which by hypothesis cannot be produced. Further on in the chapter, unemployment develops, that is to say, because people want the moon. Men cannot be employed when the object of desire, i.e. money, is something which cannot be produced and the demand for which cannot be readily choked off. It is interesting to notice that the characteristic which has been traditionally supposed to render gold especially suitable for use as the standard of value, namely its inelasticity of supply, turns out to be precisely the characteristic which is at the bottom of the trouble, something that is finite or considered inelastic. Professor Pigou has been accustomed to assume that there is a presumption in favor of real wages being more stable than money wages, and for every small fluctuation in the propensity to consume and the inducement to invest would cause money prices to rush violently between zero and infinity. That money wages should be more stable than real wages is a condition of the system possessing inherent stability. The assumption and the thing is now is that real wages are more than the money wages. And that doesn't provide for a stable system. A stable system would be if the money wage was actually representative of what the real wage is for your value of output. That the world, after several millennia of steady individual saving, is so poor as it is accumulated capital assets is to be explained, in my opinion, neither by the improvident propensities of mankind, nor even by the destruction of war, but by the high liquidity premiums formerly attaching to the ownership of land and now attaching to money. Money is starting to become more wealth indicator than owning land. I differ in this from the older view as expressed by Marshall with an unusual dogmatic force in his Principles of Economics, page 581. Everyone is aware that the accumulation of wealth is held in check, and that the rate of interest so far is sustained by the preference with which great mass of humanity have for present over deferred gratifications, or, in other words, by their unwillingness to wait. All right, so on the next page, I've highlighted full employment, the optimum rate. The neutral rate of interest can be more strictly defined as the rate of interest which prevails in equilibrium when output employment are such that the elasticity of employment as a whole is zero. Chapter 18, the general theory of employment restated. We have now reached a point where we can gather together the threads of our argument. Thus, we can sometimes regard our ultimate independent variables as consisting of 1, the 3 fundamental psychological factors, namely the psychological propensity to consume, the psychological attitude to liquidity, and the psychological expectation of future yield from capital assets. 2, the wage unit as determined by the bargains reached between employers and employees. And 3, the quantity of money as determined by the action of the central bank, so that if we take as given factors specified above, these variables determine the national income or dividend. Part 2. But an increase or decrease in the rate of investment will have to carry with it an increase or decrease in the rate of consumption, because the behavior of the public is in general of such a character that they are only willing to widen or narrow the gap between their income and their consumption if their income is being increased or diminished. That is to say, changes in the rate of consumption are in general in the same direction, though smaller in amount, as changes in the rate of income. I've highlighted a full page here. The relation between the increment of consumption which has to accompany a given investment of saving is given by the marginal propensity to consume. The ratio thus determined between an increment of investment and the corresponding increment of aggregate income, both measured in wage units, is given by the investment multiplier. Finally, if we assume that the employment multiplier is equal to the investment multiplier, we can, by applying the multiplier to the increment or decrement in the rate of investment brought about by the factors first described, infer the increment of employment. An increment or decrement of employment is liable, however, to raise or lower the schedule of liquidity preference, there being 3 ways in which it will tend to increase the demand for money. Inasmuch as the value of output will rise when employment increases, even if the wage unit and prices in terms of the wage unit are unchanged. But in addition, the wage unit itself will tend to rise as employment improves, and the increase in output will be accompanied by a rise of prices in terms of the wage unit owing to increasing costs in the short period. Okay, so if you mandate minimum wage increases, there will be a rise in the cost of goods sold, because now it costs more to produce. Thus, the position of equilibrium will be influenced by these repercussions. The equilibrium goes up, and there are other repercussions also. Moreover, there is not one of the above factors which is not liable to change without much warning, and sometimes substantially. Hence the extreme complexity of the actual course of events. Nevertheless, these seem to be the factors with which it is useful and convenient to isolate. If we examine any actual problem along the lines of the above schematicism, we shall find it more manageable, and our practical intuition, which we can take account of the more detailed complex of facts than can be treated on general principles, will be offered a less impractical material upon which to work. And that is the summary of the general theory, but the actual phenomena of the economic system are also colored by certain special characteristics of the propensity to consume. The schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital and the rate of interest, about which we can safely generalize from experience. In particular, it is an outstanding characteristic of the economic system in which we live that, while it is subject to severe fluctuations in respect of output and employment, it is not violently unstable. Indeed, it seems capable of remaining in a chronic condition of subnormal activity for a considerable period without any marked tendency either towards recovery or towards complete collapse. Where we're at now is normal. People have never wanted to work. People don't want to produce. People want to be lazy, and capitalism kind of horrifies that. And so that just causes where we're at now. The conditions of stability which the foregoing analysis suggests to us as capable of explaining the observed results are the following. 1. The marginal propensity to consume is such that when the output of a given community increases or decreases because more or less employment is being applied to its capital equipment, the multiplier relating to the two is greater than unity but not very large. And 2. When there is a change in the prospective yield of capital or in the rate of interest, the schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital will be such that the change in new investment will not be in great disproportion to the change in the former, i.e. moderate changes in the prospective yield of capital or in the rate of interest will not be associated with very great changes in the rate of investment. I told y'all towards the end of the book, he really does start just, dropping some fire knowledge, and it gets a little out of hand. I've got so many tabs right here at the very end, so many highlights. 3. When there is a change in employment, money wages tend to change in the same direction as, but not in great disproportion to, the change in employment, i.e. moderate changes in employment are not associated with very great changes in money wages. This is a condition of the stability of prices rather than of employment. And 4, we may add a fourth condition, which provides not so much for the stability of the system as for the tendency of a fluctuation in one direction to reverse itself in due course, namely that a rate of investment higher or lower than prevailed formerly begins to react unfavorably or favorably on the marginal efficiency of capital if it is continued for a period which measured in years is not very large. So all we have to do as Americans to kind of reverse the situation is just start producing more of what we're putting out. Our first condition of stability, namely that the multiplier, whilst greater than unity, is not very great, is highly plausible as a psychological characteristic of human nature. As real income increases, both the pressure of present needs diminishes and the margin over the established standard of life is increased, and as real income diminishes, the opposite is true. Thus, it is a natural, at any rate on the average of the community, that the current consumption should be expanded when employment increases, but by less than the full increment of real income, and that it should be diminished when employment diminishes, but by less than the full decrement of real income. Moreover, what is true of the average of individuals is likely to also be true of governments, especially in an age when a progressive increase of unemployment will usually force the state to provide relief out of borrowed funds. 2. Whilst our first condition provides that a moderate change in the rate of investment will not involve an indefinitely great change in the demand for consumption goods, our second condition provides that a moderate change in the prospective yield of capital assets or in the rate of interest will not involve an indefinitely great change in the rate of investment. And third, our third condition accords with our experience of human nature. For although the struggle of money wages is, as we have pointed out above, essentially a struggle to maintain a high relative wage, this struggle is likely, as employment increases, to be intensified in each individual case, both because the bargaining position of the worker is improved and because the diminished marginal utility of his wage and his improved financial margin make him readier to run risks. Yet, all the same, these motives will operate within limits, and workers will not seek a much greater money wage when employment improves or allow a very great reduction rather than suffer any unemployment at all. And wrapping it up, book 4, before we head into book 5. Similarly, of course, if investment rises to a higher figure than formerly, it is only a question of time before the marginal efficiency of capital falls sufficiently to bring about a recession unless there are compensating changes in other factors. To me, that says, and I may be wrong about this, but if it's so good to invest and be in the stock market, then the marginal efficiency of capital is going to fall and cause a recession because nobody's working and everybody's investing. So that's what we've got to watch out for. Namely, that we oscillate oscillate, avoiding the gravest extremes of fluctuation in employment and in prices in both directions, around an intermediate position appreciably below full employment and appreciably above the minimum employment, a decline below which would endanger life. The oscillations, the patterns, the cycles, he's just saying it here in his own way. Just be aware of them, and then you too can be a great financier, investor, economist, etc. Book 5, Money, Wages, and Price. Chapter 19, Changes in Money Wages. It was not possible, however, to discuss this matter fully until our own theory had been developed. For the consequences of a change in money wages are complicated. A reduction in money wages is quite capable, in certain circumstances, of affording a stimulus to output, as the classical theory supposes. My difference from the theory is primarily a difference of analysis, so that it could not be set forth clearly until the reader was acquainted with my own method, Keynes says. If this is the groundwork of the argument, and if it is not, I do not know what the groundwork is, surely it is fallacious. And this fallacious argument is that this way of thinking in any given industry is reached as follows: that we have a demand schedule for the product relating to the quantities which can be sold to the prices asked. We have a series of supply schedules relating the prices which will be asked for the sale of different quantities on various bases of cost, and these schedules between them lead up to a further schedule which, on the assumption that other costs are unchanged, except as a result of the change in output, gives us the demand schedule for labor in the industry relating the quantity of employment to different levels of wages, the shape of the curve at any point furnishing the elasticity of demand for labor. This conception is then transferred without substantial modification to the industry as a whole, and it is supposed by a parity of reasoning that we have a demand schedule for labor in an industry as a whole as relating to the quantity of employment to different levels of wages. It is held that it makes no material difference to this argument whether it is in terms of money wages or real wages. If we are thinking in terms of money wages, we must of course correct for changes in the value of money. But this leaves the general tendency of the argument unchanged, since prices certainly do not change in exact proportion to changes in money wages. It is invalid, therefore, to transfer the argument to industry as a whole unless we also transfer the assumption that the aggregate effective demand is fixed. The precise question at issue is whether the reduction in money wages will or will not be accompanied by the same aggregate effective demand as before measured in money, or at any rate by an aggregate effective demand which is not reduced in full proportion to the reduction in money wages. Kind of like, it doesn't really matter kind of like what happens about like how much you're actually paid. What really matters is like the effective demand. If without any change in these factors, the entrepreneurs were to increase employment as a whole, their proceeds will necessarily fall short of their supply price. Entrepreneurs expect the reduction in money wages. If then entrepreneurs generally act on this expectation, they will in fact succeed in increasing their profits, only if the community's marginal propensity to consume is equal to unity. The most important repercussions on these factors are likely in practice to be the following. Number 1, a reduction of money wages will somewhat reduce prices. It will therefore involve some redistribution of real income, A, from wage earners to other factors entering into marginal prime costs whose remunerations has not been reduced, and B, from entrepreneurs to rentiers to whom a certain income fixed in terms of money has been guaranteed. But if rentiers represent, on the whole, the richer section of the community, and those whose standard of life is least flexible, then the effect of this will also be unfavorable. Probably it is more likely to be adverse than favorable. So basically a rentier is somebody who lives on income from property or investments, and they have a really inflexible way of life, according to Keynes. It is evident that the change will be favorable to investment since it will tend to increase the balance of trade. And 3, thus there will be a reduction in real incomes, except in the case of the newly employed, which many tend to increase the propensity to consume. And 4, if the reduction of money wages is expected to be a reduction relatively to money wages in the future, it will also be a favorable to investment change because it will increase the marginal efficiency of capital, and it will diminish the marginal efficiency of capital and lead to the postponement both of investment and of consumption. If, moreover, the reduction in wages disturbs political confidence by causing popular discontent, the increase in liquidity preference due to this cause may more than offset the release of cash from the active circulation. Since a special reduction of money wages is always advantageous to an individual entrepreneur or industry, a general reduction may also produce an optimistic tone in the minds of entrepreneurs, and labor troubles may offset this favorable factor. Moreover, and I've starred, the effect of the lower price level on the real burden of the national debt and hence on taxation is likely to prove very adverse to business confidence. If therefore we restrict our argument to the case of a closed system and assume that there is nothing to be hoped, but if anything the contrary, from the repercussions of the new distribution of real incomes on the community's propensity to spend, it follows that we must base any hopes of favorable results to employment from a reduction in money wages mainly on an improvement in investment due either to an increased marginal efficiency of capital under 4 or a decreased rate of interest under 5, which are parts about the money wages, diminishing marginal efficiency of capital. Let us consider these two possibilities in further detail. The most unfavorable contingency is that in which money wages are slowly sagging downwards, and in each reduction in wages serves to diminish confidence in the prospective maintenance of wages. It's not going to be good if wages start falling, because then it's going to look bad, like the companies can't afford to pay their employees, when in fact it might be a necessary adjustment mechanism. It is therefore on the effect of a falling wage and price level on the demand for money that those who believe in the self-adjusting quality of the economic system must rest the weight of their argument, though I am not aware that they have done so. The quantity of money is virtually fixed. It is evident that its quantity in terms of wage units can be indefinitely increased by a sufficient reduction in money wages in proportion to incomes generally can be largely increased. By increasing the quantity of money whilst leaving the level of wages unchanged, it follows that wage reductions as a method of securing full employment are also subject to the same limitations as the method of increasing the quantity of money. It doesn't really matter kind of if we see this, we're not gonna lower the wages, we're not gonna lower the cost of the things we sell, so we just have to print more money. We're kind of always left with like those two options, and psychologically there's only really one option, which is print more money. If indeed labor were always in a position to take action and were to do so whenever there was less than full employment, to reduce its money demands by concerted action to whatever point was required to make money so abundant relatively to the wage unit that the rate of interest would fall to a level compatible with full employment, we should in effect have monetary management by the trade units aimed at full employment instead of by the banking system. It's an interesting point, because do the unions have all of the best interest at heart? I mean, it might be better for them to set the prices, and I don't entirely disagree, because the banking system, these people don't earn a real living. They sit in an office and look at numbers and flow charts and things, whereas like the real production is being done by the laborers, which the trade unions do represent. Except in a socialized community where wage policy is settled by decree, there is no means of securing uniform wage reductions for every class of labor. The result can only be brought about by a series of gradual, irregular changes, justifiable on no criterion of social justice or economic expediency, and probably completed only after wasteful and disastrous struggles, where those in the weakest bargaining position will suffer relatively to the rest. It's already within the power of most governments, by open market policy or analogous measures. They can do all of this. They can play with the levers. It can only be an unjust person who would prefer a flexible wage policy to a flexible money policy. Part 3 of Chapter 19, Changes in Money Wages. It is only in highly authoritarian society, where sudden, substantial, all-round changes could be decreed, that a flexible wage policy could function with success. One can imagine it operation such as in Italy, Germany, or Russia, but not France, the US, or Great Britain. Prices would be in unstable equilibrium when investment was at the critical level, racing to zero whenever investment was below it, and to infinity whenever it was above it. In the long period, they will only change in response to changes in the cost of production due to a new technique or new and increased equipment. So again, kind of wraps up the chapter saying like, be efficient, be efficient. Okay, Professor Pigou says in chapter 19 to the appendix, when Professor Pigou comes to deal expressly with the effect of a reduction of money wages, he begins by rejecting the argument that if marginal prime cost is equal to marginal wage cost, non-wage earners' incomes will be altered. So non-wage earners' incomes, so people who aren't W-2, they'll be altered. When money wages are reduced in the same proportion as wage earners, on the ground that this is only valid if the quantity of employment remains unaltered. Thus, Professor Pigou believes that in the long run, unemployment can be cured by wage adjustments, whereas Keynes, maintain that the real wage, subject only to a minimum set by the marginal disutility of employment, is not primarily determined by wage adjustments, though these may have repercussions, but by the other forces of the system, some of which, in particular, the relation between the schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital and the rate of interest, Professor Pigou has failed, if I am right, to include in his formal scheme. Chapter 20, the employment function. Subject to this assumption, for every level of effective demand in terms of wage units, there will be a corresponding aggregate employment, and this effective demand will be divided in determinate proportions between consumption and investment. And then he has a couple of pages of equations. Part 2, I've highlighted. Moreover, if the increased demand is directed to products with a relatively low elasticity of employment, a larger proportion of it will go to swell the incomes of entrepreneurs and a smaller to swell the incomes of wage earners and other prime cost factors, with the possible result that the repercussions may be somewhat less favorable to expenditure, owing to the likelihood of entrepreneurs saving more of their increment of income than wage earners would. I love it because it's kind of true. In response to a given increase of investment to be as great as an eventual equilibrium value, unless there are surplus stocks and surplus capacity at every stage of production. The initial elasticity of employment may approximate to unity. The elasticity will fall away, but price instability arising in this way does not lead to the kind of profit stimulus which is liable to bring into existence excess capacity. For the windfall gain will wholly accrue to the entrepreneurs who happen to possess products at a relatively advanced stage of production, and there is nothing which the entrepreneur who does not possess specialized resources of the right kind can do to attract this gain to himself. Thus, the inevitable price instability due to change cannot affect the actions of entrepreneurs, but merely directs a de facto windfall of wealth into the laps of the lucky ones. This fact has, I think, been overlooked in some contemporary discussions of a practical policy aimed at stabilizing prices. Nevertheless, there are certain practical qualifications to this conclusion. One, for a time at least, raising prices may delude entrepreneurs into increasing employment beyond the level which maximizes their profits, i.e. they may underestimate their marginal user cost in the new price environment. Okay, so that is kind of one of the things that could have caused a lot of businesses to go out of business during COVID because of the way prices fluctuated, and they didn't have kind of an understanding of the greater economic system at large, and so that caused them to go out of business. Chapter 21, the theory of prices, I've highlighted. The theory of shifting equilibrium, meaning by the latter, the theory of a system in which changing views about the future are capable of influencing the present situation. For the importance of money essentially flows from its being a link between present and future. Money is time traveling. But I think this is important pointing out that like the theory and what people think about the future does influence the present. And so that's why sales is so manipulative sometimes, because you have to convince people of a alternative future. What would it be like if you were in this car? What would it be like if you built this business? What would you be like, if you could build this business and then sell it and yada, yada, yada. These things are what's marketed and sold to you is a future outcome that may or may not happen. Money, in its significant attributes, is, above all, a subtle device for linking the present to the future. We cannot get rid of money even by abolishing gold and silver and legal tender instruments. Any durable asset that is capable of possessing any kind of monetary attributes, and therefore giving rise to the characteristic problems of a monetary economy. And as humans, we kind of have like a tendency to place means of exchange on something because we're smart. Part 3, to elucidate the ideas involved, let us simplify our assumptions still further and assume that 1, all unemployed resources are homogeneous and interchangeable in their efficiency to produce what is wanted, and 2, that the factors of production entering into marginal cost are content with the same money wage so long as there is a surplus of them unemployed. So in this case, it's constant returns in a rigid wage unit, so long as there's no unemployment. Having, however, satisfied tradition by introducing a sufficient number of simplifying assumptions to enable us to enunciate a quantity theory of money, let us now consider the possible complications of which will in fact influence events. 1, effective demand will not change in exact proportion to the quantity of money. 2, since resources are not homogeneous, there will be diminishing and not constant returns as employment gradually increases. 3, since resources are not interchangeable, some commodities will reach a condition of inelastic supply whilst there are still unemployed resources available for the production of other commodities. The wage unit will tend to rise before full employment has been reached. And 5, the remunerations of the factors entering into marginal cost will not change at all in the same proportion. Thus, instead of constant prices in conditions of unemployment and of prices rising in proportion to the quantity of money in conditions of full employment, we have in fact a condition of prices rising gradually as employment increases. Theory of prices, that is to say, the analysis of the relation between changes in the quantity of money and changes in the price level with a view to determine the elasticity of prices in response to changes in the quantity of money, must therefore direct itself to the 5 complicating factors set forth above. Part 4, the primary effect of a change in the quantity of money on the quantity of effective demand is through its influence on the rate of interest. He lists A, B, and C. I've highlighted C, the investment multiplier, which tells us by how much a given increase in investment will increase effective demand as a whole. Moreover, it is only a highly exceptional circumstance that an increase in the quantity of money will be associated with a decrease in the quantity of effective demand. So it's just like a highly exceptional circumstance that the quantity of money will be associated with a decrease in the quantity of effective demand. And then he goes on to say, but the income velocity of money is in itself merely a name which explains nothing. There's no reason to expect that it'll be constant. And 2, as we have shown above, page 41, the distinction between diminishing and constant returns partly depends on whether workers are remunerated in strict proportion to their efficiency, which many would say they are not. But in general, the demand for some services and commodities will reach a level beyond which their supply is for the time being perfectly inelastic, whilst in other directions there is a substantial surplus surplus of resources without employment. And then 4, I've highlighted a block here, that the wage unit may tend to rise before full employment has been reached requires little comment or explanation. Since each group of workers will gain set par by a rise in its own wages, there is naturally for all group pressure in this direction, which they will be more ready to meet when they are doing better business. For this reason, a proportion of any increase in effective demand is likely to be absorbed in satisfying the upward tendency of the wage unit. In actual experience, the wage unit does not change continuously in terms of money in response to every small change in effective demand. Discontinuously. In actual experience, the wage unit does not change continuously in terms of money in response to every small change in effective demand, but discontinuously. These points of discontinuity are determined by the psychology of the workers and by the policies of employers and trade unions. So let that be just a great nugget of knowledge for when you are making investment decisions. But in fact, the rates of remuneration of different factors in terms of money will show varying degrees of rigidity, and they may also have different elasticities of supply in responses to changes in the money rewards offered. Whilst it is for many purposes a very useful first approximation to observe and assume that the rewards of all factors entering into marginal prime cost change in the same proportion as the wage unit, it might be better perhaps to take a weighted average of the rewards of the factors entering into the marginal prime cost and call this the cost unit. The cost unit, or subject to the above approximation, the wage unit, can thus be regarded as the essential standard of value, and the price level given the state of technique and equipment will depend partly on the cost unit and partly on the scale of output increasing, where output increases more than in proportion to any increase in the cost unit in accordance with the principle of diminishing returns. This is important. The weighted average of the rewards of the factors, the margin call, this is the cost unit, right? So how much does it cost to have all the factors between widgets and labor actually done to create? This is what determines the actual cost of your product or service. Every previous increase in the quantity of money is likely, insofar as it increases effective demand, to spend itself partly in increasing the cost unit and partly in increasing output. It appears, therefore, that we have a sort of asymmetry on the two sides of the critical level above which true inflation sets in. This result follows from the assumption that the factors of production, and in particular the workers, are disposed to resist a reduction in their money rewards. If, on the contrary, money wages were to fall without limit whenever there was a tendency for less than full employment, the asymmetry would indeed disappear. But in this case, there would be no resting place below full employment until either the rate of interest was incapable of falling further or wages were zero. In fact, we must have some factor, the value of which in terms of money is, if not fixed, at least sticky, to give us any stability of values in a monetary system. The view that any increase in the quantity of money is inflationary, unless we mean by inflationary merely that prices are rising, is bound up with the underlying assumption of the classical theory that we are always in a condition where a reduction in the real rewards of the factors of production will lead to a curtailment in their supply. Perhaps the best purpose served by writing them down is to exhibit the extreme complexity of the relationship between prices and the quantity of money. Part 7. So far, we have been primarily concerned with the way in which changes in the quantity of money affect prices in the short period. But in the long run, is there not some simpler relationship? This is a question for historical generalization rather than for pure theory. I've highlighted certain psychological minimum out of context. But if the quantity of money remains very deficient for a long time, the escape will be normally found in changing the monetary standard or the monetary system so as to raise the quantity of money rather than in forcing down the wage unit and thereby increasing the burden of debt, right? So like I was saying before, it's more likely that we're just going to print more money, because if you actually lowered it, right, it's going to put a lot of constraint on the debt that people have, because it's not going to, to pay it back. I mean, you get it, right? Psychologically. Thus, the very long-run course of prices has almost always been upward. For when money is relatively abundant, the wage unit rises, and when money is scarce, some means is found to increase the effective quantity of money. Okay, so we've seen that also since publishing. It's the same cycle. To establish a schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital, which allowed a reasonably satisfactory average level of employment to be compatible with a rate of interest high enough to be psychologically acceptable to wealth owners. And wrapping up chapter 21, this was not accidental. It is rightly described as due to a balance of forces in an age when individual groups of employers were strong enough to prevent the wage unit from rising much faster than the efficiency of production, and when monetary systems were at the same time sufficiently fluid and sufficiently conservative to provide an average supply of money in terms of wage units, which allowed to prevail the lowest average rate of interest readily acceptable by wealth owners under the influence of their liquidity preferences. The average level of employment was, of course, substantially below full employment, of it, but not so intolerably below it as to provoke revolutionary changes. Okay, we were all just like, fine, like I could get a job if I want to, but I have this job, or I'm not doing the job right. So it's like it's low, it's not full employment, but it's not so bad that people want systemic change. The acuteness and the peculiarity of our contemporary problem arises, therefore, out of the possibility that the average rate of interest, which will allow a reasonable average level of employment, is one so unacceptable to wealth owners that it cannot be readily established merely by manipulating the quantity of money. But the most stable and least easily shifted element in our contemporary economic system has been hitherto, and may prove to be in the future, the minimum rate of interest acceptable to the generality of wealth owners. If a tolerable level of employment requires a rate of interest much below the average rates which ruled in the 19th century, it is most doubtful whether it can be achieved merely by manipulating the quantity of money from the percentage gain which the schedule of margincy efficiency of capital allows the borrower to expect to earn. There has to be deducted 1. The cost of bringing borrowers and lenders together, 2. Income and surtaxes, and 3. The allowance which the lender requires to cover his risk and uncertainty, before we arrive at the net yield available to tempt the wealth owner to sacrifice his liquidity. If in conditions of tolerable average employment this net yield turns out to be infinitesimal, time-honored methods may prove unavailing. And the last paragraph of chapter 21 about the theory of prices is, to return to our immediate subject, the long-run relationship between the national income and the quantity of money will depend on liquidity preferences, as the long-run stability or instability of prices will depend on the strength of the upward trend of the wage unit, or more precisely of the cost unit, compared with the rate of increase in the efficiency of the productive system. Book 6, Short Notes Suggested by the General Theory. Chapter 22, Notes on the Trade Cycle. If we examine the details, we shall find that it is highly complex, but I established that the essential character of the trade cycle, and especially the regularity of time sequence and of duration, which justifies us in calling it a cycle. I highlighted it's cyclical because of the patterns aggregated by short period variables of the economic system. To develop this thesis would occupy a book rather than a chapter. He defines terms that, like, a cyclical movement means that, like, the system progresses. Okay, the upward direction, the propelling forces, and then at a certain point they will be replaced by forces operating in the opposite direction. 2, having reached their maximum development, wane and give place to their opposite. Especially once things fully develop, it kind of makes way for other things to creep in. That's why you should never stop growing and bettering yourself. We mean also that there is some recognizable degree of regularity in the time sequence and duration of the upward and downward movements. Part 2. I can best introduce what I have to say by beginning with the later stages of the boom and onset of the quote-unquote crisis. We have seen above that the marginal efficiency of capital depends not only on the existing abundance or scarcity of capital goods and the current cost of production of capital goods, but also on current expectations as to the future yield of capital goods. Being based on shifting and unreliable evidence, they are subject to sudden and violent change. Explaining the crisis to lay stress on the rising influence of the increased demand for money, both for trade and speculative purposes. So people want more money for trade and speculation, kind of in the later stages of the boom. And the later stages of the boom are characterized by optimistic expectations as to the future yield of capital goods, sufficiently strong to offset their growing abundance and their rising cost of production, and probably a rise in the rate of interest also. So I just highlighted that because I think that right now we are in sort of a boom period, whether it's real estate, because it's kind of at a high interest rate, and that's kind of the high interest rates, right, have kind of lowered the demand, and so you see that little manipulation going on. But then also any kind of boom with capital goods, and right now it's AI and chipsets and data centers, and kind of what does that look like? There's a rising cost of production in those. They are trying to grow in abundance. They're just not keeping up with demand right now. So at some point, when does that change? And we have something to worry about in the sense of a lot of employees of NVIDIA, their stock prices has risen so much that they're now retiring early. And so that intellectual capital is leaving the company. It is of the nature of organized investment markets under the influencers of purchasers largely ignorant of what they are buying, and of speculators who are more concerned with forecasting the next shift of market sentiment rather than with a reasonable estimate of the future yield of the capital assets. When disillusion falls upon an over-optimistic and overbought market, it should fall within sudden and catastrophic force. So that's what we see most of the time at the onset of a Black Friday or a financial crisis, dot-com boom, whatever. It's we suddenly wake up and realize what's actually happening, and then the markets tank. So what's that going to be for the AI boom? naturally precipitates a sharp increase in liquidity preference and hence a rise in the rate of interest. Thus, the fact that a collapse in the marginal efficiency of capital tends to be associated with a rise in the rate of interest may seriously aggravate the decline in investment. But the essence of the situation is to be found nevertheless in the collapse in the marginal efficiency of capital, particularly in the case of those types of capital which have been contributing to the previous phase of heavy new investment. And there was a footnote to the sudden and catastrophic force that happens on an overbought and over-optimistic market. He says, I have shown in Chapter 12 that although the private investor is seldom himself directly responsible for new investment, nevertheless the entrepreneurs who are directly responsible will find it financially advantageous and often unavoidable to fall in with the ideas of the market, even though they themselves are better instructed. That's so interesting. As an entrepreneur myself, you may be better informed. You may have a better education. You may have a higher level of discipline. You may have a better idea or think you have a better idea. But the truth is, you kind of just are still subject to the free hand of the market. And it might be the right decision that you have to make. You might have to do such. Later on, a decline in the rate of interest will be a great aid to recovery, but probably a necessary condition of it. But for the moment, the collapse of the marginal efficiency of capital may be so complete that no practical reduction in the rate of interest will be enough. If a reduction in the rate of interest was capable of proving an effective remedy by itself, it might be possible to achieve a recovery without the elapse of any considerable interval of time and by no means more or less directly under the control of the monetary authority. So it's saying that it's like, yeah, on paper, this is like what should happen when a crisis is happening. You should, lower the rate of interest. But if that were true, then it would be like pretty much immediate and 100% up to the monetary authority. But as he's trying to argue, it's really up to the psychology of the masses. In fact, it is not usually the case, and it is not so easy to revive the marginal efficiency of capital, determined as it is by the uncontrollable and disobedient psychology of the business world. It is the return of confidence, to speak in ordinary language, which is so insusceptible to control in an economy of individualistic capitalism. This is the aspect of the slump which bankers and businessmen have been right in emphasizing, and that which the economists have put their faith in a purely monetary remedy have underestimated. Downward movement should have an order of magnitude which is not fortuitous, which does not fluctuate between, say, 1 year this time and 10 years next time. Let us recur to what happens at the crisis. So long as the boom was continuing, much of the new investment showed a not unsatisfactory current yield. The dissolution comes because doubts suddenly arise concerning the reliability of the prospective yield, which is just like case in point, anytime there's a crash, the reason has been a sudden realization that your investment is not going to produce the returns that you thought it would. And so you take your money out. If current costs of production are thought to be higher than they will be later on, that will be a further reason for a fall in the marginal efficiency of capital. Once doubt begins, it spreads rapidly. But the interval of time which will have to elapse before the shortage of capital through use, decay, and obsolescence causes a sufficiently obvious scarcity to increase the marginal efficiency may be a somewhat stable function of the average durability of the capital in a given epoch. If the characteristics of the epoch shift, the standard time interval will change. So once the characteristics change, so does the time interval. If, for example, we pass from a period of increasing population into one of declining population, the characteristic phase of the cycle will be lengthened. But we have in the above a substantial reason why the duration of the slump should have a definite relationship to the length of life of durable assets and to the normal rate of growth in a given epoch. Now the process of absorbing the stocks represents negative investment, which is further deterrent to employment, and when it is over, a manifest relief will be experienced. In the earliest phase of a typical slump, there will probably be an investment in increasing stocks, which helps to often offset the disinvestment in working capital. You could kind of argue that like the working capital of the United States is really low right now because not a lot of people want to work, and there is an increase in investment in stocks because of an increase in the monetary supply through the stimulus package and people not wanting to work, thinking that they can earn their money from investments or owning land or whatever. And finally, after the recovery is well on its way, both factors will be simultaneously favorable to investment. Unfortunately, a serious fall in the marginal efficiency of capital also tends to affect adversely the propensity to consume. Now, on the class who take an active interest in their stock exchange investments, especially if they are employing borrowed funds, this naturally exerts a very depressing influence. These people are perhaps even more influenced in their readiness to spend by rises and falls in the value of their investments than by the state of their income. With a stock-minded public, as the United States is today, a rising market may be an almost essential condition of a satisfactory propensity to consume. And that says a lot. I highlighted that because so many people have started investing and spending more because they think they can just cash in their investments. And there's nothing like kind of inherently wrong with this way of thinking, right? Because it does increase investment, and we do live in a system where things have to grow, consumption is king. And so the rising market is just a rising cost of living, and inflation is baked in, and the companies capture that, the stock market captures that. So that's why it's good to invest. I conclude that the duty of ordering the current volume of investment cannot safely be left in private hands. I don't know why I highlighted and underlined that and starred that, but that's what he concludes. Part 3. It may indicate a state of affairs where every kind of capital goods is so abundant that there is no new investment which is expected, even in conditions of full employment, to earn in the course of its life more than its replacement cost. It may, of course, be the case, indeed it is likely to be, that the illusions of the boom cause particular types of capital assets to be produced in such excessive abundance that some part of the output is, on any criterion, a waste of resources. Thus, the remedy for boom is not a higher rate of interest, but a lower rate of interest, for which he subtitles. See below page 282 for some arguments which can be urged on the other side. For if we are precluded from making large changes in our present methods, I should agree that to raise the rate of interest during a boom may be, in conceivable circumstances, the lesser evil. Further down, I've highlighted, thus an increase in the rate of interest as a remedy for the state of affairs arising out of a prolonged period of abnormally heavily new investment belongs to the species of remedy which cures the disease by killing the patient. They printed a lot of money, more people invested, and now they're trying to raise the rate of interest, which is basically going to kill us. I assert that a state of full investment in the strict sense has never yet occurred, not even momentarily, Keynes says. For in this event, the case of those who attribute the disease to underconsumption would be wholly established. The remedy would lie in various measures designed to increase the propensity to consume by the redistribution of incomes or otherwise, so that a given level of employment would require a smaller volume of current investment to support it. Basically, kind of what Elon Musk is saying might happen. There might be a huge redistribution of income by actually changing the fiat currency to some sort of central bank digital currency. And this is basically the measure taken designed to increase the propensity to consume, right? The more we buy, we have to consume, because that's what the economy is based off of, right? Be a good consumer, spend the money. And so, I don't know, maybe this is kind of where we're entering. Maybe he forecasted this, or maybe it was just a natural postulation of this system that he's just writing down, almost a full 100 years before it happens to us. Part 4. It may be convenient at this point to say a word about the important schools of thought which maintain from various points of view that the chronic tendency of contemporary societies to underemployment is to be traced to underconsumption. That is to say, to social practices and to a distribution of wealth which results in a propensity to consume which is unduly low. In existing conditions, or at least in the conditions which existed until lately, where the volume of investment is unplanned and uncontrolled, subject to the vagaries of the marginal efficiency of capital as determined by the private judgment of individuals, ignorant or speculative, and to long-term rate of interest which seldom or never falls below a conventional level, these schools of thought are, as guides to practical policy, undoubtedly in the right. Further down, I highlighted theoretically, however, they are open to criticism of neglecting the fact that there are two ways to expand output. I myself am impressed by the great social advantages of increasing the stock of capital until it ceases to be scarce. Part 5. Another school of thought finds the solution of the trade cycle not in increasing either consumption or investment, but in diminishing the supply of labor-seeking employment, i.e., by redistributing the existing volume of employment without increasing employment or output. This seems to me to be a premature policy, much more clearly so than the plan of increasing consumption. The point comes where every individual weighs the advantages of increased leisure against increased income. But at present, the evidence is, I think, strong that the great majority of individuals would prefer increased income to increased leisure, and I see no sufficient reason for compelling those who would prefer more income to enjoy more leisure. If you want to make more money, you don't need to be compelled to leisure. You should be able to do that if you want, but also be able to just go make more money and not have any time off. Mr. D. H. Robertson assumes, in effect, that full employment is an impractical ideal, and that the best that we can hope for is a level of employment much more stable than at present and averaging perhaps a little higher. I highlighted banking policy, which always nipped in the bud an incipient boom by a rate of interest high enough to deter even most misguided optimists, that the average level of useful investment might be higher if a deterrent is implied, and it might be that it overlooks the social advantage. I highlighted this implies that saving and investment can be unequal and has has therefore no meaning until these terms have been defined in some special sense. Or it is sometimes suggested that the increased saving which accompanies increased investment is undesirable and unjust because it, as a rule, also associated with rising prices. But if this were so, any upward change in the existing level of output and employment is to be deprecated. For the rise in prices is not essentially due to the increase in investment, it is due to the fact that in short periods supply prices usually increase with increasing output on account either of the physical fact of diminishing return or of the tendency of the cost unit to rise in terms of money when output increases. Or, once more, it is suggested that a boom is characterized by capital consumption, which presumably means negative net investment, i.e. by an excessive propensity to consume. But a theory which assumes constant output is obviously not very serviceable for explaining the trade cycle. He starts defining like some carryover investment, especially within farmers and agriculture. More recently, the theory has been advanced that it is bad harvests, not good harvests, which are good for trade, either because bad harvests make the population ready to work for a smaller real reward, or because the resulting redistribution of purchasing power is held to be favorable to consumption. Needless to say, it is not these theories which I have in mind in the above description of harvest phenomenon as the explanation of the trade cycle. Chapter 23, Notes on Mercantilism, the Usury Laws, Stamped Money, and the Theories of Underconsumption. All right, we've got 2 chapters left. Chapter 23, Notes on Mercantilism, the Usury Laws, Stamped Money, and Theories of Underconsumption. My first highlight says grave danger in an unfavorable balance, particularly if it results in an efflux of the precious metals, but greatly impoverish those who practice them because they forfeit the advantages of the international division of labor. The international division of labor is a very important concept. It is one of the main reasons the economy has changed so much since the 1970s. The economic history of Spain in the latter part of the 15th and 16th century provides an example of a country whose foreign trade was destroyed by the effect on the wage unit of an excessive abundance of the precious metals. I just thought like that was really interesting because I have lived in Spain previously, and you can see a lot of the history through the architecture there just by being there. And so that kind of gave me a little bit of inspiration maybe to study the metals a little bit more. You guys know I did Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, and he has a whole section in there on gold and precious metals, and I kind of skipped over it just because we don't really use precious metals that much anymore in today's day and age, but this just kind of like highlights maybe the importance of going back to that. So maybe all that shit I talked about Peter Schiff is wrong. Anyway, part 3, on the contrary, they were emphatic that the unduly high rate of interest was the main obstacle to the growth of wealth. I would agree. Diminishing liquidity preference and with an increasing quantity of money, and several of them made it clear that the preoccupation with increasing the quantity of money was due to the desire to diminish the rate of interest. Professor Heckscher sums up this aspect of their theory as follows. If you are familiar with finance, you know the Heckscher-Ohlin model. The position of the more perspicacious mercantilist was in this respect, as in many others, perfectly clear within limits. For them, money was, to use the terminology of today, a factor of production, on the same footing as land, sometimes regarded as artificial wealth. So if money is artificial, if it's a factor of production, I think this is just a good way to frame how you think about money and what it is used for. It should definitely be a tool, and it should not be worshipped in any regard. When Locke quotes from A Letter to a Friend on Concerning Usury, high interest decays trade. The advantage from interest is greater than the profit from trade, which makes rich merchants give over and put out their stock to interest. Okay. Professor Heckscher sums up as follows this strand in mercantilist thought. In the course of a century and a half, this standpoint was formulated again and again in this way, that a country with relatively less money than the other countries must sell cheap and buy dear. D-E-A-R, right? Dear. Like Dear John. The desire of the individual to augment his personal wealth by abstaining from consumption has usually been stronger than the inducement to the entrepreneur to augment the national wealth by employing labor on the construction of durable assets. For the mercantilists were under no illusions as to the nationalistic character of their policies and their tendency to promote war. It was a national advantage and relative strength at which they were admittedly aiming. With the footnote 3, within the state, mercantilism pursued thoroughgoing dynamic ends. But the important thing is that this was bound up with a static conception of the total economic resources in the world. Okay, the conception that the total economic resources in the world were static, give or take, right? Like digital age really changes that. You know, Bitcoin and things like that. I mean, yeah, sure, they kind of have a static supply, but cryptos can be minted all the time. And we see digital economies all of the time. There's a great video on YouTube about the economy of EVE Online, one of the oldest MMORPGs out there. So Very interesting stuff. For this it was that created that fundamental disharmony which sustained the endless commercial wars. This was the tragedy of mercantilism. Both the Middle Ages with their universal static ideal and laissez-faire with its universal dynamic ideal avoided this consequence. Anyway, what I have to say about mercantilism is it's probably the most fun way to play a game of Civilization. Be a mercantilist. Okay, I've got a big highlight here for most of this page in part 5. I wrote down bangers because he is dropping some fire knowledge right here. The destruction of the inducement to invest by an excessive liquidity preference was the outstanding evil. Okay, so this is what he's saying, is that nobody wanted to invest because everyone wanted to have their money in cash, and that's a big deal. The prime impediment to the growth of wealth in the ancient and medieval worlds, and naturally so, since certain of the risks and hazards of economic life diminish the marginal efficiency of capital, while others serve to increase the preference for liquidity. It was almost inevitable that the rate of interest would rise too high to permit of an adequate inducement to invest. So basically, we have high interest rates right now, upwards of 9% or more, and that's basically making it like really hard for people to want to invest. I was brought up to believe that the attitude of the medieval church to the rate of interest was inherently absurd, and that the subtle discussions aimed at distinguishing the return on money loans from the return to active investment were merely Jesuitical attempts to find a practical escape from a foolish theory. But I now read these discussions as an honest intellectual effort to keep separate what the classical theory has inextricably confused together, namely the rate of interest and the marginal efficiency of capital, whilst using rule and custom and the moral law to keep down the rate of interest. And he talks about Bentham over here, understood by projectors, all such persons as in the pursuit of wealth, or even of any other object endeavor by the assistance of wealth to strike into any channel of invention. Upon all such person as the line of any of their pursuits aim at anything that can be called improvement. So at this point he's talking about like you're gonna get wealthy if you just go try to improve things. Like just be a builder. Build and improve, whether it's creating art, going into the trades, improving someone's health, or being a doctor. Right? Whatever you're doing to improve the world at large, you're going to get wealthy. Because I think, this is not anything he thinks, but I think ethics and morals has a lot to do with money as well. And I think money is attracted to people with strong morals and strong ethics who are trying to use it for good. Yeah, so I think a great book to read on that would be by Ken Honda, Happy Money. I love that. You know, arigato your money, think your money, right? And it will come back to you. And I've practiced this a lot, this gratefulness, and it really does help change your outset on money. A prudent man, Bentham continues, will not in these circumstances pick out the good projects from the bad, for he will not meddle with projects at all. Basically meaning like if things are risky or the interest rates are too high, anyone who's prudent is not going to invest in anything because it doesn't really matter because the interest rates are so high. On the next page, as a man of some means, able to devote the last decades of his life to the two most delightful occupations open to those who do not have to earn their living, authorship and experimental farming. I love that because we all want to write a book one day, and one day we will be able to if we work hard, right, and improve society enough. And so experimental farming, I don't know quite what he means by that, but I'll have my own interpretation. I believe that the future will learn more from the spirit of Giselle than from that of Marx. The preface to The Natural Economic Order will indicate to the reader, if he will refer to it, the moral quality of Giselle, right? So here he's talking about morals and how this author, this Giselle, is probably much more impactful than Marx, but not as well known maybe. The answer to Marxism, I think, to be found along the lines of the preface. Giselle's specific contribution to the theory of money and interest is as follows. In the first place, he distinguishes clearly between the rate of interest and the marginal efficiency of capital, and he argues that it is the rate of interest which sets limits to the rate of growth of real capital. So the rate of interest sets limits to the growth of real capital, right? Because you can't actually build a sustainable nest egg or bed of wealth or whatever you want to call it when interest rates are high, because you're not able to save that and invest it. You're paying it to whoever loaned you the money. Next, he points out that the rate of interest is a purely monetary phenomenon, and that the peculiarity of money, from which flows the significance of the money rate of interest, lies in the fact that its ownership as a means of storing wealth involves the holder in negligible carrying charges, and that forms of wealth, such as stocks of commodities, which do involve carrying charges, in fact yield a return because of the standards set by money. The rate of interest, which depends on constant psychological characters, has remained stable, while the widely fluctuating characters, which primarily determine the schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital, have determined not the rate of interest, but the rate at which, more or less, given the rate of interest, allows the stock of real capital to grow. Okay, and I have a big highlight here. He altogether overlooks the need of an explanation while the money rate of interest is positive, and he fails to explain why the money rate of interest is not governed, as the classical school maintains, by the standards set by the yield on productive capital. This is because the notion of liquidity preference had escaped him. He has constructed only half a theory of the rate of interest. The incompleteness of his theory is doubtless the explanation of his work having suffered neglect at the hands of the academic world. Nevertheless, he had carried his theory far enough to lead him to a practical recommendation which may carry with it the essence of what is needed, though it is not feasible in the form of which he proposed it. He argues that the growth of real capital is held back by the money rate of interest. And I think that we can agree with that. The money rate of interest is going to hold back the growth of real capital. If interest rates are high, people aren't going to take out loans to build factories, to invest in vehicles and equipment because of the high interest rate. On page 309, right before part 7, the idea behind stamped money is sound. It is indeed possible that means might be found to apply it in practice on a modest scale, but there are many difficulties which Giselle did not face. In particular, he was unaware that money was not unique in having a liquidity premium attached to it, but differed only in degree from many other articles, deriving its importance from having a greater liquidity premium than any other article. Thus, if currency notes were to be deprived of their liquidity premium by the stamping system, a long series of substitutes would step into their shoes: bank money, debts at call, foreign money, jewelry, and the precious metals generally, and so forth. As I have mentioned above, there have been times when it was probably the craving for the ownership of land, independently of its yield, which served to keep up the rate of interest. Though under Giselle's system, this possibility would have been eliminated by land nationalization. Interest rates are driven up purely by the desire to own land and not what it can produce for you. He talks about Mandeville, Fable of the Bees, and how he took offense to Leslie Stephen's Dictionary of National Biography, in which the cynical system of morality was made attractive by ingenious paradoxes. His doctrine that prosperity was increased by expenditure rather than by saving fell in many current economic fallacies not yet extinct. The Fable of the Bees is an allegorical poem, and I'm about to read it here, so all credit goes to Bernard Mandeville. Okay. The grumbling hive, or knaves turned honest, in which is set forth the appalling plight of a prosperous community in which all the citizens suddenly take it into their heads to abandon luxurious living, and the state to cut down armaments in the interest of saving. No honor now could be content to live and owe for what was spent. Liveries and brokers' shops are hung. They part with coaches for a song, sell stately horses by whole sets, and country houses to pay debts. Vain cost is shunned as moral fraud. They have no forces kept abroad. Laugh at the esteem of foreigners, and empty glory got by wars. They fight, but for their country's sake, when right or liberty is at stake. The haughty Chloe contracts the expensive bill of fare, and wears her strong suit a whole year. And what is the result? Now mind the glorious hive and see how honesty and trade agree. To show is gone at thins apace, and looks with quite another face. For 'twas not only they that went, by whom vast sums were yearly spent, but multitudes that lived on them were daily forced to do the same. In vain to other trades they'd fly, all were o'erstocked accordingly. The price of land and house falls, miraculous palaces those walls, like those of Thebes, were raised by play, are to be let. The building trade is quite destroyed. Artificers are not employed. No limner for his art is famed. Stone cutters, carvers are not named. So the moral is, bare virtue can't make nations live. In splendor, they that would revive a golden age must be as free for acorns as for honesty. So a couple of footnotes here. In his History of English Thought in the 18th Century, Stephen wrote, page 297, and speaking of the fallacy made celebrated by Mandeville, that the complete confutation of it lies in the doctrine, so rarely understood that its complete apprehension is, perhaps, the best test of an economist, that demand for commodities is not demand for labor. And on the next page, compare Adam Smith, the forerunner of the classical school, who wrote, "What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom," probably with reference to the above passage from Mandeville. Right? What you do in your heart, in your family, for you, does not need to be the same thing that's done for the kingdom and the community at large, I suppose. Adam Smith has stated that capitalists are increased by parsimony, that every frugal man is a public benefactor, and that the increase of wealth depends upon the balance of produce above consumption. But it is quite obvious that they are not true to an indefinite extent, and that the principles of saving pushed to excess would destroy the motive to production. If every person were satisfied with the simplest food, the poorest clothing, and the meanest houses, it is certain that no other sort of food, clothing, and lodging would be in existence. The two extremes were obvious, and it follows that there must be some intermediate point. What, I would ask, would become the demand for commodities if all consumption except bread and water were suspended for the next half year? What an accumulation of commodity! What a prodigious market would this event occasion? I highlighted, and I wrote COVID next to it, question mark, because think about that. All consumption was suspended for about a while anyway, except for bread and water. Now, was this global manipulation of sorts? Or was it just, disaster capitalism at its finest? But what happened to the market afterwards? It was very prodigious. And so he's just postulating here, if this were to happen, it would create a prodigious market because you would artificially constrain the supply in order to build up the supply so that later, anyway, you get it. So he says on page 317, he's talking with a man, and he said, "This man entangled me in a controversy about excessive saving, which he regarded as responsible for the underemployment of capital and labor in periods of bad trade." Just thought it was an interesting note. Something about flat earth in here. How could there be any limit to the amount of useful saving when every item of saving went to increase the capital structure and the fund for paying wages? Sound economists could not fail to view with horror an argument which sought to check the source of all industrial progress. Even then, I hardly realized that in appearing to question the virtue of unlimited thrift, I had committed the unpardonable sin. And then they point out in their preface as follows the nature of the conclusions which they attack. Saving enriches and spending impoverishes the community along with the individual, and it may be generally defined as an assertion of the effective love of money is the root of all economic good. Not merely does it enrich the thrifty individual himself, but it raises wages, gives work to the unemployed, and scatters blessings on every side. From the daily papers to the latest economic treatise, from the pulpit to the House of Commons, this conclusion is reiterated and restated till it appears positively impious to question it. Yet the educated world, supported by the majority of economic thinkers, up to the publication of Ricardo's work, strenuously denied this doctrine, and its ultimate acceptance was exclusively due to their inability to meet the now exploded wage fund doctrine. That the conclusion should have survived the argument on which it logically stood can be explained by no other hypothesis than the commanding authority of the great man who asserted it. Economic critics have ventured to attack the theory in detail, but they have shrunk appalled from touching its main conclusion. Our purpose is to show that these conclusions are not tenable, that an undue exercise of the habit of saving is possible, and that such undue exercise impoverishes the community, throws laborers out of work, drives down wages, and spreads that gloom and prostration through the commercial world which is known as depression. And then I highlighted, now saving, while it increases the existing aggregate of capital, simultaneously reduces the quantity of utilities and conveniences consumed. His supposing that it is a case of excessive saving causing the actual accumulation of capital in excess of what is required, which is in fact a secondary evil which only occurs through mistakes of foresight, whereas the primary evil is a propensity to save in conditions of full employment more than the equivalent of the capital which is required, thus preventing full employment except where there is a mistake of foresight. Hobson and Mummery were aware that interest was nothing whatever except payment for the use of money. I think that's important to remember, is that when you borrow on interest, you are paying to use money. That's all it is. So that's why people who loan money are typically very wealthy, because people are paying them money to use their money. Not a bad position to be in. Chapter 24. Concluding notes on the social philosophy towards which the general theory might lead. The outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide for full employment and its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and incomes. The bearing of the foregoing theory on the first of these is obvious, but there are also two important respects in which it is relevant to the second. Since the end of the 19th century, significant progress towards the removal of a very great disparities of wealth and income has been achieved through the instrument of direct taxation, income tax, and surtax, and death duties. It is of course true that a fiscal policy of heavy death duties has the effect of increasing the community's propensity to consume. So if you know that you're going to be taxed a lot on your wealth, you're going to consume more, right? For my own part, I believe that there is social and psychological justification for significant inequalities of income and wealth, but not for such large disparities as exist today. There are valuable human activities which require the motive of money making and the environment of private wealth ownership for their full fruition. Further down I highlighted, it is better that a man should tyrannize over his bank balance than over his fellow citizens. Though in the ideal commonwealth men may have been taught or inspired or bred to take no interest in the stakes, it may still be wise and prudent statesmanship to allow the game to be played, subject to rules and limitations, so long as the average man, or even a significant section of the community, is in fact strongly addicted to the money-making passion. Part 2. But we have shown that the extent of effective saving is necessarily determined by the scale of investment, and that the scale of investment is promoted by a low rate of interest. So, low rates of interest means more people want to invest. Invest in not just the stock market, but invest in capital or plant or equipment or property or whatever it is to, raw materials, whatever they're investing in to create something or cause a return of some sort. Thus, it is to our best advantage to reduce the rate of interest to the point relatively to the schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital at which there is full employment. Page 326, discover their labor cost of production plus an allowance for risk and the cost of skill and supervision. That was important probably in context. At the same time, we must recognize that only experience can show how far the common will embodied in the policy of the state ought to be directed to increasing and supplementing the inducement to invest, and how far it is safe to stimulate the average propensity to consume without foregoing our aim of depriving capital of its scarcity value within 1 or 2 generations. Further down, I highlighted, for in such matters, it is rash to predict how the average man will react to a changed environment. Yeah, I guess that's true. We never really know exactly how people are going to react to rising or falling interest rates. That's probably why they do it so in such small increments. The state will have to exercise a guiding influence on the propensity to consume, partly through its scheme of taxation, partly by fixing the rate of interest, and partly perhaps in other ways. I wonder what other ways they do it. Furthermore, it seems unlikely that the influence of banking policy on the rate of interest will be sufficient by itself to determine an optimum rate of investment. I conceive, therefore, that a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment will prove the only means of securing an approximation to full employment. But beyond this, no obvious case is made out for a system of state socialism which would embrace the most of the economic life of the community. Further down, I highlighted, moreover, the necessary measures of socialization can be introduced gradually and without a break in the general traditions of society. And further down, pointing out that its tacit assumptions are seldom or never satisfied, with the result that it cannot solve the economic problems. Our criticisms of the accepted classical theory of economics has consisted not so much in finding logical flaws in its analysis as in pointing out that its tacit assumptions are seldom or never satisfied, with the result that it cannot solve the economic problems of the actual world. Thus, apart from the necessity of central controls to bring about an adjustment between the propensity to consume and the inducement to invest, there is no more reason to socialize economic life than there was before. To put the point concretely, I see no reason to suppose that the existing system seriously misemploys the factors of production which are in use. There are, of course, errors of foresight, but these cannot be avoided by centralizing decisions. It is in determining the volume, not the direction of actual employment, that the existing system has broken down. He says he agrees with Giselle. Furthermore, the modern classical theory has itself called attention to various conditions in which the free play of economic forces may need to be curbed or guided, but there will still remain a wide field for the exercise of private initiative and responsibility. So, a wide field for the exercise of private initiative and responsibility. Discipline equals freedom, right? So, what you do is the most important thing. You have to be in control. Nobody's coming to save you. You have to make all of these decisions. You have to educate yourself. You have to know what to invest in, what to consume, and you have to make those decisions for yourself. Not the government, not your neighbor, not the media, not the commercial. Within this field, the traditional advantages of individualism will still hold good. Let us stop for a moment to remind ourselves what these advantages are. They are partly advantages of efficiency, the advantages of decentralization, and of the play of self-interest. The advantage to efficiency of the decentralization of decisions and of individual responsibility is even greater. But above all, individualism, if it can be purged of its defects and its abuses, is the best safeguard of personal liberty, in the sense that, compared with any other system, it greatly widens the field for the exercise of personal choice. It is also the best safeguard of the variety of life, which emerges precisely from this extended field of personal choice, and the loss of which is the greatest of all losses of the homogeneous or totalitarian state. For this variety preserves the traditions which embody the most secure and successful choice of former generations. It colors the present with the diversification of its fancy, and, being the handmaid of experiment as well as of tradition and of fancy, it is the most powerful instrument to better the future. The most powerful instrument to better the future is going to be personal responsibility for self and for those that depend on you. And the best way to do that is to educate yourself, work, invest, right? Do all of these things, be a frugal person in many respects. Page 330. Whilst therefore the enlargement of the function of government involved in the task of adjusting to one another the propensity to consume and the inducement to invest would seem to a 19th century publicist or to a contemporary American financier to be a terrific encroachment on individualism, I defend it, on the contrary, both as the only practical means of avoiding the destruction of existing economic forms in their entirety and as the condition of the successful functioning of individual initiative. Further down I highlighted, but if effective demand is adequate, average skill and average good fortune will be enough. So if the demand is there, all you need to be do is average and just have some average luck, average good fortune. That's why I think like so many people who go into business doing things that are just in demand all of the time are going to be successful. The authoritarian state systems of today seem to solve the problem of unemployment at the expense of efficiency and of freedom. It is certain that the world will not much longer tolerate the unemployment which, apart from brief intervals of excitement, is associated, and in my opinion inevitably associated, with present-day capitalistic individualism. But it may be possible, by a right analysis of the problem, to cure the disease whilst preserving efficiency and freedom. Part 4. I have mentioned in passing that the new system might be more favorable to peace than the old has been. It is worthwhile to repeat the emphasis on that aspect. On the next page, the interest of different nations, there lay concealed a less benign influence, and those statesmen were moved by common sense and a correct apprehension of the true course of events. Further down, I said, and we must add, if they can also attain equilibrium in the trend of their population. Interesting highlight. Okay, last page. But apart from this contemporary mood, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. I think this is very important that he calls this out at the very end of the book, because he's basically saying that a lot of what we believe and a lot of what the people in power do is based off being slave to some economist that they read, or some theory that they, haven't really tested out, or something like that. And there's just way more to it than some intellectual who wrote a thesis on economics. From the field of economic and political philosophy, there are not many who are influenced by new theories after they are 25 or 30 years of age, so that the ideas which civil servants and politicians and even agitators apply to current events are not likely to be the newest, but sooner or late it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. That's what he closes with. So that wraps us up on Keynes, one of them anyway. And I think that being 35 and just kind of knowing from 25 to 30 and having gone through college, you kind of do get stuck in this economic theory. And then you have people even in today's day and age, and I mean, Sue Zorman, Dave Ramsey, Grant Cardone, anybody who's stuck in real estate. These are all very different approaches to what is our economic system, and not necessarily any one of them are right. Adam Smith might like Dave Ramsey more because, right, the economy flourishes from a more frugal man. But Keynes and Grant Cardone might get along better because, you have to invest and you have to consume. And that is what causes the growth. So I thought it was a really enveloping read. It does get started a little slow, but towards the middle, man, he really starts dropping some fire and doing some, verbal mic drops. So tell me what you guys thought about it. I thought it was a great read if you've read it in total. Next, I'm working on Trade Wars or Class Wars. Came out around just after 2020. I think it's a very important one to go through. And then I think we're going to do The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. So please, if you liked it, consider subscribing and leaving a comment, smashing that thumbs up button to help the algorithm. I know this is one of those long form and very niche productions. I do this in my free time. This is a passion project because this is just kind of the stuff that I like. My day job, I'm an electrician. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope to hear the comments, and I'm really excited to see some of the other content produced from portions of it from any other economist or aspiring economist or financiers or finance majors or anybody who is any way related to this field, and what your personal experiences are, because to kind of piggyback off of Keynes, I think that we really do need to have more of an open discussion about what we see is happening rather than what the educated elite's book theory tells us should be happening with the economy.